Montana, summer, 1878. A gunshot cracked through the canyon and shattered the silence. The cowboy on horseback leveled his revolver, eyes cold as riverstone, then froze. No rustler, no mercenary, a woman, dust-stained dress, bare feet bleeding, arms clutching a berry basket, trembling in the middle of his creek, but holding his gaze like she had no intention of looking away. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know this was your land." From a single warning shot above a wild berry patch to a love that shook an entire frontier. "Watch now, trust me. You won't want to miss a single chapter." The wind came first. It always did out here. It rolled down from the canyon walls in long, moaning gusts, bending the tall grass flat and carrying with it the smell of pine and cold stone. Then came the hoofbeats, heavy, rhythmic, the kind that shook the earth just enough to remind you how small you were standing on it. And then, cutting through everything, like a blade through silk, the sharp metallic click of a revolver being cocked. Silence followed. Jedediah Westford sat motionless on his horse, one hand steady on the reins, the other wrapped around the grip of his .44. He'd been riding the eastern boundary line since before sunrise, 3 hours in the saddle. 3 hours of watching the ridgeline, scanning the creek bed, listening for the sounds that didn't belong, the low murmur of men moving cattle that weren't theirs, the clank of equipment Vance's hired men liked to drag across his property when they thought nobody was watching. He heard something, though. Not men, not cattle, something softer, closer to the ground. The creek curved sharply around a stand of black cottonwoods just past the ridge's eastern drop, and that's where the sound was coming from. A rustling, steady, quiet, deliberate. The sound of someone who didn't want to be heard, but wasn't quite good enough at it yet. Jed clicked his tongue. His horse, a big bay gelding named Calhoun, moved forward without complaint. He came around the cottonwoods with his revolver already raised, and he fired. The shot cracked through the canyon air like a thunderbolt. It went wide, 2 feet to the left of the birch tree he'd aimed at, which is exactly where he'd meant for it to go. A warning, clean, clear, no room for misunderstanding. What he expected to find when the echo died was a rustler diving for cover, or one of Vance's mercenaries scrambling to explain himself. What he found instead made him pull Calhoun up so hard the horse grunted in protest. A woman. She stood ankle-deep in the creek shallows, frozen solid. A woven basket hung from the crook of one arm. Her other hand was pressed flat against her chest, like she was trying to hold her own heartbeat in place. She was young, somewhere in her mid-20s, with dark hair falling loose from a braid that had clearly given up on itself sometime around midday. Her dress was pale cotton, once white maybe, now the color of dust and hard travel. It clung to the full, generous curves of her body in the heat, damp from the creek water that had soaked the hem up to her knees. Her eyes were brown, wide, and fixed on him with an expression that was 1 part terror and 2 parts something he couldn't quite name. Not weakness, not begging. Something fiercer than that, pressed down hard beneath the fear. Berries. The basket was full of blackberries. Some of them were rolling slowly down the weave, dropping one by one into the water around her feet. She'd been picking them from the wild brambles along his creek bank, had probably been at it for a while, judging by how full that basket was. Jed lowered the revolver, slowly. He studied her, for a moment, the way you study any unfamiliar situation out here, looking for what's actually happening beneath the surface of what you're seeing. She wasn't armed. She wasn't part of any crew. She was alone, standing in his creek, holding a basket of blackberries, and she was trembling so hard he could see it from 10 yards out. He holstered the gun. She let out a breath. It was barely audible, but it was there. And then she spoke. Her voice came out quieter than the creek, quieter than the wind moving through the cottonwood leaves above them. She pressed her lips together first, like she was choosing the words with great care. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't know. Jed dismounted. He moved without rushing, looping Calhoun's reins around a low branch before stepping to the edge of the creek bank. He crossed his arms over his chest, studying her from the bankake with the kind of calm that came from years of learning to read people fast and read them accurately. She didn't look away. He'd give her that much. Most people grown men. Some of them couldn't hold his gaze for more than a few seconds. Too many years of hard living had carved his face into something that didn't exactly invite casual conversation. But this woman stood her ground in that creek, barefoot, trembling, with blackberry juice on her fingers, and she looked him straight in the eye. You didn't know this was private land, he said. No, sir, she swallowed. There were no markers, no fence. I came down from the North Trail, followed the creek south. I only meant to. I was only looking for food. Her voice was Eastern. Boston, maybe, or somewhere close to it. Educated. The cadence of someone who'd grown up reading books and using full sentences in every conversation, not clipping words the way frontier folks learned to do out of pure efficiency. He looked at the basket, looked at her feet. She was barefoot in the creek. Yes, but it took him only a second to spot the reason. Her shoes practical, low-heeled things that had probably been sensible enough when she'd put them on that morning, were sitting on a flat rock at the creek's edge. They'd been set there with care, toes pointing outward, like she was planning to put them back on when she was done. But her feet, he could see them through the clear, shallow water. The left heel had a raw, weeping blister the size of a silver dollar. The right one wasn't much better. She'd been walking on those feet for miles, maybe more, and she'd stepped into the creek not just to cross it, but because the cold water was the only relief she could find. Something shifted in him. Not pity, he knew pity, and this wasn't it. More like recognition. The kind that comes from knowing what it is to push yourself past the point where your body is asking you to stop, because stopping isn't a choice you can afford to make. He'd walked on worse. He'd walked on much worse. How far have you come? He asked. She hesitated, like. The answer embarrassed her more than the trespassing did. I left Bannack this morning, she said. Around dawn, Jed said nothing for a moment. Bannack was 11 miles northeast, 11 miles of rocky trail through canyon country, climbing and descending, crossing 3 creek beds before you even hit the eastern slope of his ridge. He looked at the shoes on the rock, looked at the blisters on her feet, looked at the careful, deliberate way she was holding herself upright, despite the fact that she had to be exhausted down to the marrow. He picked up her shoes from the rock, held them out to her. Put those on, he said. Then get out of the creek. She blinked, like that wasn't the response she'd prepared herself for. She waded to the edge, and he turned half away to give her the privacy of getting her shoes on without him, staring, studying instead, the bramble line along the bank where she'd been picking. The berries were thick here, heavy on the vine, ripe almost to bursting. Good wild blackberries, the kind Hannah had been making preserves from every summer, for as long as he'd owned this land. He heard her sharp intake of breath when she put the shoe on over the blister. She didn't make any other sound. When he turned back, she was standing on the bank, upright, chin level, basket held in both hands now, and she was looking at him with those dark brown eyes and that expression he still couldn't quite name. I'll leave now, she said. I'm sorry for the trespass. She started to turn. You'll leave when I say, he said. Not unkind, just flat, and not before I know your name and what you're doing 11 miles from town on foot. She stopped, turned back slowly. Mabel Henderson, she said. I'm the new school teacher. I arrived in Bannack 4 days ago. I was told there are families living along the Ridge Miners families, with children who haven't attended class in months. I was trying to reach them. On foot, he said, alone, with no map. I had directions. Whose directions? A flicker of something irritation maybe crossed her face. A man at the general store. He said to follow the North Trail, take the creek south, and I'd find the ridge settlements before noon. Jed was quiet for a moment. He knew exactly who she'd gotten directions from. Connolly, the general store owner, who gave terrible directions to everyone on principle because he thought it was funny, and who had almost certainly looked at this prim, soft-voiced Eastern woman with her city shoes and sent her directly into the wrong canyon out of sheer amusement. "You're 4 miles too far south," he said, and on the wrong side of the ridge. Her jaw tightened. Just barely, but he caught it. "I see," she said. "The families you're looking for are on the western slope. Connolly sent you the long way around." She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them again, and whatever frustration had flickered through her was gone. Pressed back down into that place, she seemed to keep things when she decided they weren't useful. "Then I'll correct my course," she said. "Thank you for the information." She started to turn again. "Miss Henderson." She stopped again. This time she turned back a little slower, and the patience in her expression was the practiced kind the kind teachers developed, he supposed, when dealing with difficult situations. "You're not walking 4 miles back and then 3 miles over the ridge on those feet today," he said. "It'll be dark before you get halfway, and the temperature drops fast this time of year once the sun goes behind the canyon. You'll rest, get those feet tended to, and in the morning, I'll show you the right trail." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her thinking it, through all the reasons this was improper, all the questions a sensible woman would ask about walking into a strange man's ranch house on the Montana frontier. All the things she'd been taught about what a woman of her standing did and didn't do. Then she looked at her shoes, and he was fairly certain she felt that blister announce itself again. "I don't want to impose," she said. "You're not being given the choice," he said, and turned to untie Calhoun. He let her ride. She'd argued that briefly, pointing out that she was perfectly capable of walking, and he'd pointed out with equal brevity that the ranch was 2 miles, and her feet were in no condition, and that had been the end of it. She'd allowed him to help her up into the saddle, accepting the hand up without making anything of it, which he appreciated, and she'd sat straight-backed and composed as he led Calhoun by the reins along the creek bank toward home. He walked. She rode. It was the sensible arrangement. Neither of them spoke much on the trail back. That was fine. Jed had never been a man who filled silence just to fill it, and she seemed to understand that. She looked around at the landscape instead, at the great red stone walls of the canyon, at the way the late afternoon sun turned the creek into hammered copper, at the hawks circling the high thermals above the ridge. Her eyes moved the way a person's eyes moved when they were genuinely looking, not just glancing. Taking it in, storing it. He noticed she held the berry basket carefully in her lap the entire way, making sure the berries didn't spill. The ranch came into view around the last bend the main house first, a long, low structure built from local pine and river stone, solid as the ridge it sat against. Then the barn beyond it, the smokehouse, the small bunkhouse where his 2 ranch hands slept. The kitchen garden was still going strong this late in summer, and the smell of something cooking drifted out from the open kitchen window. Hannah, she appeared in the doorway, before they were halfway across the yard. A stout, gray-haired woman in a flour-dusted apron, wiping her hands on a cloth, squinting at them with the sharp, evaluating eyes she used for assessing everything from weather to people, to whether a pot of beans was ready. Her gaze went from Jed to the woman on his horse, then back to Jed, then back to the woman. "Found her on the creek bank," Jed said, preempting the question. "Picking berries," Mabel said, with a composure that Hannah clearly found either impressive or alarming, possibly both. "Picking berries," Hannah repeated. She descended the porch steps, drying cloth still in hand, and came up alongside Calhoun to get a proper look. Up close, her face was warm, despite the sharpness of her gaze. Lines around her eyes and mouth that came from more smiling than frowning over a long life. "You look like you've walked from the Mississippi," she said. "Only from Bannock," Mabel said. "Same thing." in those shoes. Hannah clucked her tongue. She reached up and offered her hand, the competent, no-nonsense hand of a woman who had been helping people on and off horses for 30 years. Come down from there. I've got hot water and something that'll take the sting out of those blisters. And supper's going to be ready in an hour. Mabel looked briefly surprised by the efficiency of the welcome. Then she took Hannah's hand and climbed down. Jed led Calhoun to the barn. By the time he'd unsaddled and watered the horse, brushed him down, and come back inside through the kitchen door, Hannah had already installed Mabel at the kitchen table with her feet in a basin of warm salted water and a cup of tea steaming beside her. Hannah was cutting strips of clean linen for bandages, moving with the practiced economy of a woman who had been the nearest thing to a doctor within 20 miles for the better part of 2 decades. Mabel's hands were wrapped around the teacup. Her eyes were closed, not in distress, in something closer to relief. The kind of relief that comes when you've been holding something tightly for a very long time, and someone quietly gives you permission to set it down for a moment. She opened her eyes when she heard him come in. "Better?" he said. "Considerably," she said. Then, with the faint formality of someone who'd been raised to say these things regardless of circumstance, "Thank you for not sending me off with a rifle pointed at my back." Hannah snorted from across the kitchen. "That's a low bar you're setting, young woman." "I've had a particular kind of day," Mabel said. Hannah laughed, a genuine one from the chest. She set her linen strips on the table and pulled up a stool, sitting down to begin wrapping the worst of the 2 feet, with the practiced gentleness that contradicted her blunt manner entirely. Mabel watched her work and didn't flinch, even when the bandage pressed against the raw heel. Jed poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and leaned against the counter. He wasn't entirely sure why he was staying in the kitchen. He could have gone to the study or the porch. He usually did after coming in from a long ride, but something held him there against the counter, turning the coffee cup in both hands, watching these 2 women at the table, the older one bent over her work with quiet competence, the younger one sitting very straight despite her obvious exhaustion, listening to Hannah's steady commentary about trail conditions and proper footwear on the Montana frontier. "You said you're the new school teacher, Ed." Mabel looked up. "Yes? Where are you from? Boston?" A brief pause. "Originally. My father's family has been there for 4 generations. Long way to come to teach miners' children." She met his eyes directly. "Yes," she said. "It is." She didn't offer anything else. He didn't push. But there was something in the way she said it, not defensive, not apologetic, just clear. Like she'd answered that question in her own head so many times that she'd worn it smooth, and what was left was just the truth of it. She had come a long way, on purpose, and she didn't owe him the reasons. He could respect that. "There are 11 children on the western ridge," he said instead, "ranging from about 6 to 14. 3 of the older ones can read some. Most of the younger ones can't at all. Their fathers work the Vance Shaft claim. Long days. The mothers do what they can." She was watching him carefully now, like she hadn't expected that level of detail. "You know the families?" she asked. "I know my neighbors," he said. He took a sip of coffee. "Good people, working themselves to the bone for wages that barely cover what Vance charges them for housing on his company. Lots their kids deserve a fighting chance." He said it without theater. It was just a fact, plain as the stove in front of him. But something in the room changed very slightly when he said it, a small shift in the quality of the air, like a window being opened. Mabel set her teacup down. "Then I have 11 reasons to get those bandages right," she said to Hannah. Hannah looked up from her wrapping and smiled. Supper was venison stew and cornbread, and there was enough of it that the absence of the 2 ranch hands out overnight moving cattle to the south pasture barely made a dent. Hannah served it at the big kitchen table without ceremony, and they ate without much preamble. Mabel ate with appetite and without apology for it, which Jed noticed because in his experience, Women from the eastern cities had been taught to eat like birds in company, picking at their food and offering elaborate commentary about how very little they required. She ate like someone who had been walking 11 miles and had earned every bite of it. Hannah kept her cup full. They talked mostly Hannah and Mabel, working through the practical geography of the ridge and the logistics of setting up a proper classroom. Jed listened, contributing when he had something to add and staying quiet when he didn't. It was somewhere in the middle of the second cup of tea that Mabel talked about Boston. She didn't intend to, he thought. It came out from somewhere underneath the practical conversation, the way things sometimes surface when a person is warm and fed and sitting still. For the first time, after a brutal day, she talked about the school she'd trained at, the education she'd worked for, the carefully constructed future she'd been building, the small apartment, the teaching position secured at a children's academy, the engagement to a man from one of Boston's old families. Her voice stayed even, steady. He called it off in March, she said, not to anyone in particular. Looking at her cup, he said his mother and sisters had expressed concerns that I wasn't the image the family required. A small pause. He used the word suitable several times. Hannah made a low sound. Not a word, just acknowledgement. He meant my figure, Mabel said plainly. That's what he meant. I was not small enough or fine-boned enough or whatever specific shape a proper Boston wife was meant to be. She looked up. There was no tremor in her voice. There was something harder than trembling, a clean, cold anger that had been turned over and refined into something close to resolution. So, I resigned the position, packed what I had, and applied for the post in Montana. Because if the world I'd been trying to fit into was that small, I wanted no part of it. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the stove crackled once. Jed set down his coffee cup. He looked at her, at this woman who had walked 11 miles on blistered feet into the wrong canyon on bad directions, who had stood in his creek and met his eyes without flinching, who had eaten her supper without apology and told her story without performing grief over it. He pushed back from the table, stood up. He crossed to the hallway door and went through it without explanation. Hannah raised her eyebrows at Mabel, who raised hers back. They heard his boots on the wooden floor of the passage beyond. A door opened, a brief silence. Then he came back. He was carrying a pair of boots, women's boots, leather, well made, clearly old but carefully kept, the laces new and the soles solid. He set them on the table in front of Mabel without any particular ceremony. Just set them down and stood with his arms at his sides. Those belonged to my mother, he said. She was a broad woman, strong, built for real work, not drawing room furniture. He looked at Mabel steadily. They'll fit you better than what you came in with. The soles are good. They'll hold up on the ridge trails. Mabel looked at the boots. She looked up at him. He could see her working out whether to refuse them. Working out the propriety of it, the weight of accepting something like this from a man she'd known for 3 hours, the particular complicated arithmetic of dignity and need. Miss Henderson, he said, and something in his voice cut through the arithmetic. Not harshly, just directly. The Rocky Mountains out there don't need to be skinny to be grand. He said it like it was obvious, like it was geology. In Montana, a person's worth is measured by their heart and their work, not the size of their dress. The kitchen was very quiet again. Mabel looked at the boots for a long moment. Then she reached out and picked them up. She turned them over carefully in her hands, examining the workmanship with the same focused attention she'd given the canyon walls and the creek water on the ride-in. They're beautiful, she said. They're practical, he said. But yes. Hannah was looking at the fire, and not at either of them, with the elaborately casual expression of a woman who was in fact paying very close attention to everything happening in the room. Mabel set the boots down beside her chair. She looked up at Jed. Thank you, she said, and she didn't qualify it or diminish it or surround it with reassurances about how she'd return them or replace them. Just said it. clean and straight. He nodded once, picked up his coffee cup, went back to the stove. Outside, the canyon wind moved through the cottonwoods. The first stars were coming out over the ridge, cold and sharp in the August dark. Somewhere far off, a coyote called once and went silent. Mabel Henderson sat at Jedediah Westford's kitchen table, in his dead mother's chair, with a pair of boots sitting on the floor beside her that were already more hers than anything Boston had ever offered. And she did not whisper her apology again. She didn't need to. The morning came in slow and gray, the way Montana mornings often did in late summer fog, sitting low in the canyon, the peaks invisible. The world shrunk down to just the yard and the barn and the dark tree line beyond. Mabel woke before the household did. She lay still for a moment in the narrow bed Hannah had made up for her in the small room off the kitchen, a room that smelled of dried lavender and cedar, that had a patchwork quilt in earth tones and a single window that looked out onto the kitchen garden. She listened. The house was quiet. The wind had dropped in the night. Outside, a single bird was going through its repertoire, somewhere in the pine trees, unhurried, methodical, like it had all the time in the world. She sat up carefully, testing her feet against the floor. The right one protested. The left one was worse. Hannah's wrapping had held through the night, and the salted water had done its work. But blisters didn't improve on a timeline you got to choose. She stood anyway, pulled her dress straight, tidied her hair as best she could without a proper mirror, and moved quietly into the kitchen. The stove had banked down to coals overnight. She found the wood box, found the kindling, and built the fire back up the way her grandmother had taught her, before Boston had decided that sort of knowledge was beneath a woman of her family standing. She put the coffee pot on, found the oats, found a pot. She was stirring the oats when Hannah appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy shawl, gray hair loose around her shoulders. The older woman stopped, looked at the fire going, the coffee on, the oats on the stove, looked at Mabel. "You didn't have to do that," Hannah said. "I know," Mabel said. "Sit down." Hannah studied her for a moment with those sharp eyes. Then she pulled a chair out and sat down, which told Mabel more about Hannah Miller than the older woman probably intended. A woman who let herself be served without elaborate protest was a woman who was tired enough to be honest about it. They had coffee together at the kitchen table while the oats cooked. The fog pressed against the window. Hannah wrapped both hands around her cup and talked about the Ridge families, who they were, how long they'd been here, which children were sharp and which ones needed patience, which mothers might help, and which fathers might push back on the idea of schooling over labor. Mabel listened with the focused attention she gave everything, asking the right questions, the specific ones that told you she was building a picture rather than just collecting facts. Jed came in from the barn as the sun was beginning to burn the fog off. He'd been up and out early. She'd heard the barn door at some point before full light, half woken by it, then gone back to sleep. He came in smelling of horses and cold air, poured himself a cup of coffee without preamble, and joined them at the table. "Feet?" he said to Mabel. "Functional," she said. "That's not the same as good." "No," she agreed. "But it's enough." He looked at her for a moment, accepted that, turned to his coffee. Hannah served the oats. They ate. Outside, the fog retreated up the canyon walls, and the mountains began to show themselves. First, the lower slopes, then the long rocky ridgelines, then the peaks, still holding a trace of last winter's snow in the high couloirs. Mabel watched it happen through the window, with the quiet absorption of someone who had spent her whole life in a city of brick and glass, and was still adjusting to the fact that the world could be this large. "I'll take you over the ridge after breakfast," Jed said. "Show you the trail to the settlement. It's easier going than what you found yesterday." "I'd appreciate that," she said. Hannah refilled cups without being asked, because that was simply how Hannah moved through a kitchen, constantly, efficiently, missing nothing. They rode out together, that morning, 2 horses this time. Hannah had found a small, steady mare In the back pasture, a gray named Biscuit, who had the calm temperament of an animal that had seen everything the frontier could throw at a person and had arrived at an opinion of general indifference toward all of it. Mabel rode her without difficulty. She'd had some lessons as a girl, enough to sit a horse without embarrassing herself, though she said as much plainly when Jed had asked. The trail over the western ridge was different from the creek canyon she'd followed the day before. It climbed through open meadow first, the grass still wet with morning dew, wildflowers in the last stretch of their summer run, blue and gold, and the deep rust red of Indian paintbrush. Then it entered the timber, and the light changed, became cool and layered, filtering through the pine canopy in long, tilted shafts. They rode mostly in silence. A comfortable one, the kind that develops naturally between people who have already established, without needing to discuss it, that they don't require constant noise to justify each other's company. At the high point of the trail where the ridge crested and the western slope opened before them, Jed stopped his horse. Mabel pulled Biscuit up beside him. Below, the valley spread out in a broad, timbered bowl. She could see the settlement from here, a cluster of rough cabins, a few outbuildings, the gray scar of the mine shaft cut into the hillside to the north. Smoke from morning cook fires. A child running between two of the cabins, too far below to see clearly. Just a small moving figure against the brown earth. 11 children, she said softly, remembering what he'd told her last night. Give or take, he said. Depends on the season. Some families move on when the wages dry up. New ones come. She looked at the mineshaft scar on the hillside. Even from this distance, it had an ugly quality, raw, indifferent to the land around it. Vance's operation, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Jed's voice was flat, controlled in the way of a person who has strong feelings about a subject and has learned to keep them on a short leash. He runs the men 12 hours a day when the ore is running good, 10 when it's slow. Pays them in company script they can only spend at his store, at his prices. She looked at him. Company script, she said, so they can never actually accumulate real money. That's the design. She turned back to the valley. The small running child had disappeared inside one of the cabins. Then, educating those children isn't just about reading, she said. It's about giving them the tools to understand what's being done to them and to build something different. Jed looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, more like recognition. That's one way to put it, he said. It's the accurate way, she said, and touched her heel to Biscuit's side. The settlement families received her with a wariness that she understood and didn't take personally. These were people who had learned, through experience, that strangers coming down from the ridge usually meant one of two things: Vance's men with new conditions or officials with papers. A young woman from Boston on a gray mare, in a borrowed dress, and a dead woman's boots was outside that category entirely, and they didn't quite know what to do with her. She introduced herself plainly, told them what she was there for, used direct language, not the careful condescension she'd heard other educated Easterners use when addressing working-class families, the slow, loud speech of someone who has confused poverty with stupidity. Jed hung back, stayed near the horses, close enough to be visible because his presence meant something in this valley, whatever his reclusive reputation might suggest, but far enough not to crowd her. He understood, she thought, that this was her work, that she needed to establish herself in it on her own terms. A woman named Clara Briggs was the first to really engage. Mid-30s, strong-faced, with 2 children at her skirts and a third on her hip. She listened to Mabel's explanation with the careful attention of someone who had learned to evaluate propositions quickly and accurately. Free, she said. You're saying there's no charge? None, Mabel said. Not now, not ever. My purpose here is to teach. Clara looked at her steadily. Vance's man told us last spring that the schooling idea would interfere with the boys' work schedules. Said educated miners were trouble. Educated miners, Mabel said, understand their rights. I imagine that does look like trouble from where Mr. Vance is standing. Clara Briggs smiled, slowly, but genuinely. You're not what I expected, she said. People rarely are, Mabel said. By midday, she had spoken to 7 families. She had 4 firm commitments, 2 Mabes, and 1 firm refusal from a man named Driscoll, who said his boys were needed at the shaft, and that was the end of it. She stored that information away without argument. She'd come back to Driscoll. People who said, never usually meant not yet. Jed was quiet on the ride back, but it was a different quality of quiet than the morning. More thoughtful. He was processing something. Halfway back over the ridge, he said, you handled Clara Briggs well. She's a smart woman, Mabel said. Smart women respond to honesty. Most people do, he said. They just don't always get offered it. She glanced at him. His profile against the mountain sky, the weathered jaw, the eyes that were always scanning, always working, taking in the landscape in the practiced way of someone who'd spent years learning that attention was survival. You don't say much, she observed, but when you do, you mean it. He considered that. Seemed like a sensible policy, he said. She laughed. Small, genuine. She hadn't laughed much in the past several months, and it surprised her a little to find that the reflex still worked. That evening, after supper, she sat with Hannah by the kitchen fire. The windows were dark, and the wind had come back up outside, moving through the canyon with a low, resonant sound like a distant choir. Hannah was mending a shirt. Mabel was reading. She'd found a book on the shelf in the small parlor, a collected volume of territorial land statutes, of all things, which she had carried back to the kitchen with the enthusiasm of someone who had found exactly what they were looking for, without knowing they were looking for it. Jed came in from the porch, where he'd been going over ranch accounts. He stopped when he saw what she was reading. That's not exactly leisure reading, he said. I'm not exactly a leisure reader, she said. She didn't look up. Mr. Westford, who holds the water rights to the creek that runs through your eastern boundary. A pause. He moved to the table and sat down across from her. I do, he said. Registered in 1872. Why? She turned a page. Because I've been thinking about what you said about Vance and the company script. A man who controls wages also usually moves to control resources. Water is the most fundamental one. She looked up now. Has he made any approach to you about the spring? Jed was very still for a moment. Not yet, he said. He will, she said, if he hasn't already started laying the legal groundwork. She looked back down at the book. Your registration, do you have the original survey documents? The ones that establish the boundary and the water access? In the study, he said. You should check them, she said. Look specifically at the language around water rights conveyance. Some of the earlier territorial registrations have language that's ambiguous enough to be challenged if someone with money decides to challenge it. Hannah had stopped mending. She was watching this exchange with the expression of someone watching a chess game being played by people considerably faster than herself. Jed leaned back in his chair. He looked at Mabel with an expression she couldn't quite read, not quite surprise, not quite amusement, something between them. You came out here to teach school, he said. I did, she said, but I'm also a person who likes to understand her surroundings. All of them, including the legal and economic ones. Where did you learn land law? My father's library, she said, was a lawyer. He never thought to lock it. She turned another page. He also didn't particularly expect his daughter to read it. But there you are. Hannah made a quiet sound that might have been a laugh. Jed pulled the land law book toward himself and looked at the page she was on. He read for a moment. His expression changed. This section, he said. Yes, she said, that one. They sat together at the kitchen table for the next 2 hours, going through the statutes. Jed brought the survey documents from the study. They spread them across the table, Hannah moving the supper things aside to make room, and Mabel cross-referenced the language in the original registration against the statute framework with the methodical precision of someone who had been doing exactly this kind of work, careful, detailed. consequential her entire adult life. Just doing it for other people's children now, instead of for Boston drawing rooms. At some point, Hannah made more tea and went quietly to bed. Neither Mabel nor Jed noticed. They worked by lamplight. She pointed. He read. He questioned. She answered. And when she wasn't certain, she said so plainly, which he seemed to appreciate more than confident wrongness would have cost him. He had a good mind for it, practical, direct, impatient with abstraction, but quick with application. It was past 10 when he finally sat back, both hands flat on the survey map. The registration is solid, he said. But you're right about the conveyance language. There's a gap. There's a gap, she agreed, which needs to be addressed before Vance finds someone to exploit it. He looked at her across the lamplight. You've been here 2 days, he said. And a half, she said. And you've already mapped the legal vulnerabilities of my water rights. She folded her hands on the table. Looked at him directly, Mr. Westford, she said. I came out here because I wanted a life where what I knew and what I could do were worth something, where my usefulness wasn't measured against my appearance. She paused. I intend to be very useful. He held her gaze. The lamp flame wavered in a draft from somewhere. I believe you, he said. Simple. Certain. She nodded. Once gathered the statutes. He rolled the survey map back up, and they said goodnight at the kitchen door with the quiet ease of two people who have, without planning to, spent a significant evening together and come out of it knowing each other considerably better than when they went in. She stayed 3 days at the Westford Ridge Ranch. This was not what she had planned. She had planned to see the settlement, arrange the schooling, and find lodgings in Bannock that were within her salary. Those plans encountered the practical reality of a frontier town, with limited boarding options for a woman alone, a salary that wouldn't begin until the first term officially started, and feet that needed several more days of Hannah's particular variety of medical attention before they'd carry her 11 miles reliably. She worked for her keep. She was clear about that from the first morning, and Hannah received the offer with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a woman who had never seen the sense in false modesty on either side of an arrangement. Mabel helped in the kitchen, helped with the kitchen garden, and spent her afternoons either reading in the small parlor or sitting at the kitchen table with whatever problem she was working through. Jed went about the ranch. She saw him at meals and sometimes in the evenings. He had a life that was built around physical work and solitude, and she moved through the edges of it without trying to reshape it. But in the evenings, they talked. She told him about Boston, not the version of Boston she'd been trained to present, the version with the elegant parties and the respectable family and the tasteful apartment, the real version. Her mother's early death, when Mabel was 11, the father who had buried himself in his work afterward, and left his daughter largely to raise herself among his law books and his colleagues' carefully averted eyes. The grandmother who had taught her to cook and light fires and the names of useful plants, and who had told her, with great directness, that a woman who could only be decorative was a woman who was one bad circumstance away from helplessness. He listened. He didn't offer sympathy, which she found she preferred. He just listened, with the full attention of someone who was actually interested, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. In exchange, slowly and in pieces, he told her about the war. Not the battles, not the details. Just the outline that he'd gone at 21 and come back at 23 into a world that had changed around him while he was away, and he hadn't quite fit back into the shape it expected. That the ranch had been his father's, left to him when the old man died of a fever the year after the war, and that he'd come here, partly because Montana was far enough from everything that the expectation of fitting in was considerably reduced. You built something here, she said. Trying, he said. You did, she said. I can see it. The families on the ridge, they trust you. That's not nothing. That's not nothing at all. He was quiet for a moment. Then people trust you too, faster than they should, maybe. Clara Briggs had her guard up for years before you showed up. I just talked to her like she was intelligent, Mabel said, which she is. A lot of people would call that a low bar. A lot of people keep it low on purpose, she said. He looked at her and smiled. It was the first time she'd seen it, a real one, not the controlled expression he usually maintained, but an actual smile that reached his eyes and changed his face completely. It was startling, the difference it made, like watching a shutter open. She looked back at the fire. On the fourth morning, her feet were well enough. She said so at breakfast. Jed nodded. Hannah said nothing, which meant she agreed. After the meal, Hannah went to the garden. Mabel stood at the kitchen counter. The new boots, her boots. She was already thinking of them that way on her feet, solid and warm, and built for real ground. Jed came in from checking the horses. He stood in the doorway a moment. "I'll ride you to Bannack," he said. "You can set up whatever you need for the school from there. If you need help getting supplies to the ridge, I know a man with a wagon who owes me a favor." She turned to face him. "That's generous," she said. "It's practical," he said. "Same thing, sometimes." She studied him for a moment, this man who had fired a warning shot and then led her horse home by the reins, who had knelt at his mother's memory and handed her something he didn't need to give, who had sat with her over land law by lamplight without making anything of it, without performing it, just because it was useful, and he was the kind of person for whom usefulness was its own sufficient reason. "Mr. Westford," she said. "Jed," he said. He'd said it once before, 2 nights ago, so quietly she'd almost thought she'd imagined it. She nodded. "Jed." She held his gaze. "Thank you. For all of it, not just the boots." His jaw moved slightly. "You're welcome, Miss Henderson." A pause. "Mabel." She picked up her basket, refilled with blackberries by Hannah that morning, a fact which had made her unexpectedly emotional in a way she'd kept entirely off her face, and walked toward the door. The morning was bright and cold and very clear. The peaks stood out hard against a deep blue sky. The pine trees smelled sharp and good. The ground under her new boots was solid. She walked out onto the Montana frontier and left her footprints in the dust. September came to the frontier like a warning. The air changed overnight, sharper, thinner, carrying in it the first distant threat of what was coming. The goldenrod along the creek banks burned brighter, the way things do just before they go. The aspens on the high slopes were already turning, pale gold running through the green like a lit match moving through dry paper. Mabel noticed all of it from the window of Mrs. Pratt's boarding house on Bannack's Main Street, where she'd taken the smallest room, the one, without a view of anything except the hardware store across the road, because it was the only one she could manage on a schoolteacher's salary until the term officially began, and the county made good on its arrangement. She noticed it, filed it away, and got back to work. The work was considerable. Establishing a school in an established building with a salary and a school board behind you was one thing. Establishing one from the ground up in a frontier town where the most powerful man in the county actively preferred that the local children to remain uneducated was another project entirely. She had a list. She had always worked from lists, not because she lacked the ability to hold things in her head, but because a list was something you could cross off. And crossing things off was the closest thing to progress you could hold in your hand on a hard day. The list had 12 items on it. By the end of her first week in Bannack, she'd managed 4. 1. Introduce herself formally to Mayor Ackerman, who was a cautious man, a fence-sitter by nature, but not actively hostile. He'd granted her provisional use of the town hall on Wednesday and Friday afternoons. 2. Write to the county education office to confirm her appointment and request the supply allotment she was entitled to. She'd received a form letter in return. She was cautiously optimistic about the supplies. 3. Contact every family on the Western Ridge with a written note delivered by the Briggs boy, who turned out to be 11 and keenly interested in any activity that gave him an excuse to ride the trails. His name was Thomas, and he had a gap-toothed grin and an excellent memory, and she immediately identified him as the kind of student who would either accomplish extraordinary things or cause extraordinary problems, possibly both simultaneously. 4. Locate a blackboard. This last item had taken 3 days and a particular sequence of negotiations that she would later describe to Hannah in a letter as the most complex transaction I have undertaken since obtaining my teaching certificate, and marginally less demoralizing than my engagement. She found the blackboard in the back room of Connolly's general store. The same Connolly who had given her the catastrophically wrong directions on her first day in Montana. She bought it from him with such pleasant, unyielding efficiency that he seemed genuinely uncertain, afterward, how the transaction had happened. The town hall proved less simple than Mayor Ackerman's provisional approval had suggested. The first Wednesday session went well. 8 children arrived, ranging in age from 6 to 13. Thomas Briggs predictably arrived first and sat in the front. A small girl named Lucy Driscoll arrived second, which surprised Mabel considerably, given that her father had been the firm refusal. And then she understood, when she saw the careful way Lucy positioned herself at the end of the row furthest from the door, that the child had come without her father's knowledge. She said nothing about it. She would think about Driscoll later. She taught. She was very good at it. This was not arrogance. It was the same clear-eyed self-assessment she applied to everything. She was good at teaching because she understood that the point of a lesson was not to demonstrate the teacher's knowledge, but to create the conditions in which a student's own understanding could develop. She'd believed this since she was 17 and had read a slim volume of educational philosophy that her father had accidentally included in a package of law texts. The second Friday session was interrupted. She had just finished working through basic arithmetic with the older students' fractions, which Thomas had taken to with an enthusiasm that was gratifying, and which a boy named Garrett had resisted with an equal and opposite energy when the door opened. Sterling Vance walked in. She knew who he was immediately, not because she'd met him, but because of the quality of attention in the room the moment he appeared. Children stiffened. Thomas Briggs, mid-sentence about denominators, simply stopped talking. Vance was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, carrying his wealth in the fabric of his coat and the shine of his boots. He had a face built for projecting authority, square jaw, small eyes that were always calculating, and he moved through the town hall door like a man who had never in his adult life opened a door and found something on the other side that surprised him. He looked at the children, looked at the blackboard, looked at Mabel. "Miss Henderson," he said. His voice was smooth, expansive, the voice of a man accustomed to being the most important person in every room. "I've heard about your project here. Admirable ambition." "Thank you," she said pleasantly. "We're in the middle of a lesson. Perhaps you could state your business briefly." His eyes moved across the room again, assessing. "My business is the town's business. I'm afraid Mayor Ackerman has had to reconsider the use of this building. Scheduling conflicts. A slight, apologetic spread of the hands. Town hall is needed for county purposes through the fall season. I'm sure you understand." She looked at him. The children were very quiet. Thomas Briggs was watching Vance with the alert stillness of a boy who had grown up watching his father come home from a 12-hour shift and had learned to read men of power very accurately. "I have a written authorization from Mayor Ackerman, dated the 17th, she said, "granting provisional use through December." "Authorizations can be revised," Vance said, pleasantly. "I'm sure you'll find suitable alternative arrangements." He looked at the children one more time. "Miners' kids only need pickaxes, not books. That's just the practical reality of what their lives will require." The room was dead silent. Lucy Driscoll, at the far end of the row, had gone very still. She was 6 years old, and she was listening to a man tell her what her life would require. Mabel set down her chalk. She turned fully to face Vance. Her hands were at her sides. Her voice, when she spoke, was entirely measured. "Mr. Vance," she said, "the children in this room are the sons and daughters of men who work your mine and build your profits. Their capacity for learning is not determined by their father's occupation, and their futures are not yours to prescribe." A pause. "I'll be in touch with Mayor Ackerman directly about the scheduling question. Good afternoon." He looked at her. The pleasant expression didn't leave his face, but something moved behind it. "Good afternoon, Miss Henderson," he said, and left. The door closed. 8 children turned to look at her. "Fractions," she said. "Garrett, you were about to show me why you think a half and 2/4 are different amounts." Thomas Briggs laughed. The tension broke. Garrett caught, grabbed his slate, and began drawing. She went to see Mayor Ackerman the following morning. The interview was not satisfying. Ackerman was, as she had assessed him, a fence-sitter, and Vance had clearly already been to see him because the mayor received her with an excess of apologetic regret that told her the decision had already been made before she walked in. The written authorization, he explained, had been premature. There were scheduling complications. He was certain she would find another arrangement. He wished her the very best in her educational endeavors. She thanked him politely and walked out of his office onto the main street. She stood in the autumn sunshine for a moment, thinking. Then she got on Biscuit. She'd kept the mayor on a temporary arrangement with Jed's ranch hand, which had been agreed to simply and without fuss, and rode to Westford Ridge. Jed was in the east pasture when she arrived, mending fence with one of his hands. Hannah spotted her from the kitchen garden and waved. Mabel left Biscuit at the fence rail and went to the kitchen to wait. He came in within the half hour, still carrying his fence tools, and stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She told him, directly, in order, without editorializing, which she found was usually more effective than editorializing anyway, because it let the facts make the argument. He listened. He set his tools down on the porch rail. He came into the kitchen and poured a cup of coffee and stood at the counter while she finished. When she was done, "Vance said that," he said. "That miners' kids only need pickaxes, not books." "In front of 8 children," she said, "including Lucy Driscoll. She's 6. The line of his jaw tightened. He drank his coffee. He put the cup down. "There's a cabin on the north edge of the ranch property," he said. "My grandfather built it when he first came out. It hasn't been used in years, but the structure is solid log walls, sound roof, good south-facing windows for light. It's sitting on an acre of cleared ground." She looked at him. "It needs work," he said. "The floor is rough. There's no proper furniture. The window frames need reglazing." A pause. "But it's on my land, which means Vance can't touch it. And it's 2 miles from the settlement, closer to those families than the town hall ever was." She was very still. "Jed," she said carefully, "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking," he said. "I'm offering." He straightened from the counter. "Come look at it. Tell me what you'd need." She looked at it. The cabin was perhaps 20 feet by 16, built from peeled pine logs that had gone silver gray with age, but were still hard as iron, the chinking between them sound. The door needed a new hinge. The floor was rough-hewn planks, uneven, with gaps between some of them wide enough to lose a chalk stub. The south windows were generous. Someone had designed this building with light in mind, which told her something about whoever had built it. She stood in the middle of the single room and turned slowly, looking at the walls, the windows, the floor, the ceiling. Jed stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her think. "The floor is the main problem," she said. "Children sitting on those gaps will lose pencils and catch splinters." "I can plane it," he said. "Sand the edges." "The windows need glass," she said. "Winter will make them impossible otherwise. 2 panes, maybe 3. I can get them from Billings." She turned again, looking up at the log rafters, where dusty light came through 2 places the roof needed tending. "How long?" she said. 2 weeks, he said. "Maybe less if the weather holds." She looked at him. "You'd do that," she said. Spend 2 weeks building a schoolroom on your land for other people's children. He looked back at her steadily. They're my neighbor's children, he said, and Vance just told them to their faces that their lives are already decided. A pause. I don't think much of that point of view. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to look at the room. We'll need benches, she said. Simple ones, plank benches, nothing elaborate. A proper shelf for books along the north wall where the light won't fade the spines. A place for the blackboard, she pointed. There, so the children face away from the windows. And don't squint. I can build the benches, he said. And the shelf. I'll help, she said. He looked at her. You can build, he said. My grandmother believed a woman who couldn't make basic repairs to her environment was a woman at the mercy of it, she said. She was not in favor of that position. A brief, genuine look of appreciation crossed his face. Your grandmother sounds like she would have done well in Montana, he said. She would have run the place inside of a year, Mabel said. They started work the following morning. It became the pattern of the next 12 days. Mabel rode out from Bannack before 8, arriving at the cabin as Jed was already at work. Hannah appeared mid-morning with food and a great deal of unsolicited but entirely accurate commentary on the progress. Jed worked with the focused competence of a man who had built and repaired things all his life, no wasted motion. No hurry, no theater about it. He planed the floor with a long hand plane, working in even strokes across the grain, and she watched the rough planks become smooth under it. He checked his work constantly with the flat of his palm, running it across the surface, hunting for high spots and ridges. She worked beside him. She was useful. She'd told him she would be, and she was. She held boards while he fitted them, worked the draw knife on the bench legs. When he showed her the technique, swept the endless curls of wood, shaving out of the way. When he fit the new window glass carefully, in the methodical way of someone who knew how much it cost and how far it had come, she held the frame while the putty set. They worked mostly in companionable quiet, but sometimes they talked. He told her, on the third day, about his mother. Not much he was, not a man who offered much all at once, but in pieces. That she'd been a school teacher herself, briefly, before marrying his father and coming west. That she'd taught in a one-room school in Ohio for 2 years and had talked about it until the end of her life as the best work she'd ever done. Mabel listened to this carefully. She thought about the boots on her feet, said nothing about the connection, because some things didn't need to be spoken to be understood. On the 6th day, Hannah came at midday with food and found them both on the floor, Mabel cross-legged with a piece of sandpaper, working the edge of a bench leg smooth, Jed beside her fitting a mortise joint in the bench frame. Hannah looked at this arrangement and smiled to herself and said absolutely nothing about it. On the 10th day, Jed was finishing the last of the window frames when Mabel sat back from the shelf brackets she'd been attaching and looked at the room. It was transformed. The floor shone with the clean, pale gold of fresh planed pine. The windows admitted a wide, generous fall of afternoon light. The south wall held 3 good plank benches, smooth-edged, solid. The shelf ran the full length of the north wall. The blackboard, her blackboard, carried out from Bannack on the wagon, was mounted where she'd indicated, angled just slightly so it would catch the morning light. She stood up slowly, walked to the center of the room, stood there in the light. Jed came to stand beside her. He looked at what they'd made together. Both of them were quiet. Outside, through the new glass of the south windows, she could see the ridge descending toward the settlement. She could see the tree line, and below it, the smoke from the family cabins. She could see, if she looked at the right angle, the dark scar of Vance's mine on the north hillside. He told those children their futures were already decided, she said. He did, Jed said. She looked at the shelf that would hold books, the floor that would hold small feet, the blackboard that would hold equations and words and maps, and everything else a mind needed to know. It had somewhere to go. He was wrong, she said. Jed looked looked at her profile against the afternoon light, the set of her jaw, the steadiness of her eyes. He was wrong, he agreed. The school opened on the 15th of September. 10 children came on the first day. Thomas Briggs arrived first and sat in the exact center of the front bench, as though he had been waiting his entire life for a front bench to sit on. Lucy Driscoll came with her mother, who had apparently had a significant conversation with her husband that she described only as settled. Garrett came and sat in the back, but he came. Even 2 children from a family who'd moved down from the northern claim arrived, a girl of 9 and her younger brother, who sat with his knees together and his eyes moving over the room with the focused, hungry attention of someone who had been waiting for something without knowing quite what. Mabel stood before the blackboard. She looked at the 10 faces in front of her. Jed had slipped in at the back and stood against the wall, arms crossed, not making anything of it. She picked up the chalk. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Miss Henderson. This is your school." She paused, making sure the word landed. "Not the county school. Not Mr. Vance's school, yours." She wrote 3 words on the blackboard, in large, clear letters. Read, think, build. "These are the 3 things you're going to learn to do here," she said. Read because language is the thing that lets you understand what the world is telling you and what it's trying to hide. Think because information without judgment is just noise. And build. She tapped the chalk against the board because understanding what's wrong is only the beginning. The rest of it is making something better. Thomas Briggs was watching her with shining eyes. Lucy Driscoll was watching the board. The boy in the back, the one who'd come with his sister from the northern claim, had leaned forward very slightly, without seeming to notice he'd done it. "We're going to start," she said with numbers, "because numbers don't lie, and a person who understands numbers can see through the ones that do." She began to write at the back of the room. Jed Westford uncrossed his arms. He looked at the 10 children bent over their slates. He looked at the woman at the board, chalk in hand, her voice clear and even and unhurried, building something one careful sentence at a time. He had helped plane the floor. He had fitted the windows and built the benches. He had thought that was his part in this. He was beginning to understand. It was only the beginning. October arrived with teeth. The first hard frost came on a Thursday, overnight, and by morning the kitchen garden was finished. Hannah walked out at dawn, looked at the blackened stems, and came back inside without comment. She put the coffee on. There was nothing else to say about it. Winter in Montana didn't ask for your opinion. Mabel rode out from Bannack through the cold, with her breath coming in small clouds and the trail hard under Biscuit's hooves. She was thinking about fractions, specifically about Thomas Briggs, who had advanced so quickly through the fraction unit that she'd had to write ahead in her lesson book 3 times in 2 weeks, and about Lucy Driscoll, who had arrived one morning with a bruise on her wrist that she said was from falling, and that Mabel had looked at once and understood, and then proceeded with the day's lesson as though she had seen nothing. Because sometimes the most useful thing you can do for a child is make the classroom feel completely safe and entirely normal. She was thinking about those things when she rounded the last bend toward the ranch and saw 2 horses she didn't recognize tied at the front rail. She slowed Biscuit, came into the yard at a walk. Jed was on the porch. 2 men stood below him, on the steps not quite on the porch, not quite invited up. Both wore decent coats and carried leather satchels. One held a rolled document. She knew before she dismounted what she was looking at. She'd grown up around her father's legal colleagues. She knew a filed document and the men who carried them. Jed's face was still, too still. The kind of stillness that happened when a man was keeping a strong reaction under very deliberate control. She tied Biscuit at the rail and came up the path. The man with the document glanced at her, back at Jed. He clearly wasn't sure what to do with her arrival, which told her he'd assessed her as irrelevant. "She stored that information too, Miss Henderson," Jed said. His voice was even. These men are from the Territorial Land Office. Apparently, there's been a filing regarding the Eastern Creek. She stopped at the base of the porch steps. What kind of filing? She said. The man with the document cleared his throat. A water rights conveyance challenge, he said. On behalf of the Vance Mining and Resources Company. They've applied to the Territorial Court to reclassify the spring-fed creek running through the Westford eastern boundary as a public waterway, which would make the water rights open to commercial claim. He unrolled the document partway. Mr. Vance's ore processing operation requires a consistent water source capable of running an ore crusher. The underground spring on this property is the most suitable source within the operational radius. Mabel climbed the porch steps and held out her hand. The man looked at her hand, looked at Jed. She can read it, Jed said. The man handed it over. She read it standing on the porch in the October cold, turning pages, going back twice to reread specific sections. The two officials waited. Jed watched her. It took her 4 minutes. She rolled the document back up and handed it to Jed. The application is based on a 1,874 Territorial Act provision for public waterway reclassification, she said. They're arguing that any natural water source above a certain flow volume qualifies as a public waterway if it can be demonstrated that commercial use would serve the broader territorial economy. She looked at the official. What is the filing deadline for a counter-application? He blinked. 30 days from the date of official notice. And what constitutes sufficient counter-evidence to trigger a formal hearing rather than an administrative ruling? He blinked again. A competing survey and documented historical use evidence. But I should say that the Vance Company's legal team is. Thank you, she said. We'll have a counterfiling within the deadline. Good morning. The two men looked at each other. They looked at Jed. Jed said nothing. Just waited. The silence did its work, and the men gathered themselves and left. She watched them ride down the ranch road. Turned to Jed. His jaw was tight. She could see what the document had cost him to stand there and hold, not just financially, though the threat was real and serious, but something more personal. This was his mother's land. His father's registration, the creek where the berry brambles grew, and the water ran clean and cold, even in August. The spring feeds the creek, which feeds the ranch water supply, she said. And the families on the ridge. Yes, he said. If Vance dams it upstream to run his crusher, the downstream flow drops enough to make the lower creek unreliable. Your cattle lose a reliable source. The ridge families lose the cleanest water within 2 miles. Yes, he said again. She turned and walked into the house. He followed. She was already at the kitchen table with the survey documents by the time he came through the door. Hannah had appeared from somewhere and set coffee down without being asked, and then positioned herself at the stove with the alert neutrality of a woman who was listening to everything. Sit down, Mabel said, and bring me the original 1,872 registration. All of it, not just the boundary pages. He sat. He brought the documents from the study. She spread them across the table and began cross-referencing, moving between the survey map, the registration language, and the copy of the Territorial Act provision she'd asked him to get from his study shelf last month, the volume she'd noticed on her second day here and asked about. He'd gone very quiet. She recognized it, the silence of a man trying to work out what he was facing and not yet sure he had all the pieces. You're trying to handle this alone, she said without looking up from the documents. A pause. It's my problem, he said. She did look up then. It's the Ridge family's problem, too, she said. It's Thomas Briggs' family's problem. It's the Driscoll children's problem. It's a problem for every person in this valley who drinks from that creek or runs cattle near it or plans to still be here in 5 years. She held his gaze. And right now, I am looking at your survey documentation, which means I am already in this problem with you. So we can discuss it as a shared matter, or you can keep trying to carry it alone. But you don't actually have the option of keeping me out of it. I'm already in. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his posture shifted. Not collapse, nothing like that. Just the small, almost imperceptible release of a man who has been holding a weight by himself and has been offered and decided to accept a second pair of hands. All right, he said. Tell me what you see. She turned the survey map to face him and pointed. The 1,874. Act provision they're citing requires that the water source in question flow above a minimum volume threshold to qualify as a public waterway. There's a measurement standard written into the Act itself. Most legal teams miss it because it's in the appendix rather than the body of the text. She pulled a separate page. Your 1,872 registration includes a flow measurement taken at the time of survey. It's in the footnotes, she pointed. This number, if the spring's current flow falls at or below this historical measurement, the reclassification provision doesn't apply. Vance's team is betting you'd know. The appendix standard exists. Jed looked at the numbers, looked up. How did you find that? He said. My father's library had a full set of territorial legislative records, she said. I read them when I was 14. Because there was nothing else on that shelf I hadn't already read. She allowed herself a small, dry expression. He thought I was reading the novels he kept on the bottom shelf. I was reading those too, but the law was more useful. He almost smiled. And if the current flow exceeds the registration measurement, then we need a current survey done by a licensed territorial surveyor, filed before their 30-day window, documenting the flow data and establishing continuous historical use since 1,872. She sat back. Which is possible. Your record's good. You've been here 6 years. You've used that water continuously. You have documentation of cattle operations dating to your father's original settlement. She paused. What we need is a surveyor and a counterfiling. He was already thinking. She could see it, the practical machinery of a man who dealt in real problems and real solutions, engaging with the problem's actual shape. Surveyor named Aldous in Billings, he said. Decent man. Fair. Can he be here within the week? I can ride tomorrow, he said. Good. She turned back to the documents. I'll draft the counterfiling language tonight, so you have something to work from when you speak with him. I know the form these applications need to take. She picked up a pencil. Your registration is solid, Jed. The creek is yours. We just have to prove it louder than Vance's lawyers do. He watched her begin to write. The scratch of pencil on paper in the quiet kitchen. Hannah moved at the stove. Outside, the wind was coming up across the ridge. Mabel, he said. She looked up. I am not a delicate piece of glass to be locked away. In a cabinet, Mr. Westford, she said before he could speak. Firmly, clearly. I have a mind and I choose to stand right beside you. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. Whatever you were about to say, I know what's at stake here. I know what happens to those families if Vance wins this. I know what it means for the school, for the children, for everything we've built on this ridge in the last 2 months. Her voice was entirely level. I'm not here to be thanked and sent home. I'm here to help win it. The room was quiet. Hannah turned from the stove very deliberately and busied herself with something that required her complete attention in the opposite direction. Jed Westford looked at the woman across his kitchen table, pencil in hand, survey document spread before her, eyes clear and direct and absolutely certain. I know, he said quietly. I know you are. He reached across the table and turned one of the survey pages toward himself, picked up his own pencil, and began to read. They worked side by side through October. The counterfiling went in on the 12th day, drafted by Mabel, reviewed by Aldous, the surveyor, who arrived from Billings and spent 2 days on the creek with measuring equipment and a careful eye. His numbers, when they came in, were clear. The spring's flow rate fell below the threshold in the Act's appendix. The reclassification provision didn't apply. Vance's legal team pushed back with a second filing disputing the measurement methodology. Mabel spent 3 evenings writing the rebuttal. She sat at Jed's kitchen table. She was there most days now, riding out from Bannack in the mornings, teaching on the ridge in the afternoons, working on the water rights case in the evenings, and she worked through the legal language with the same patient, methodical precision she brought to everything. Jed brought her coffee, checked on the fire, sat across from her sometimes, reading the ranch accounts or the previous filings, available when she needed to talk something through, and quiet when she didn't. He rode to the territorial court in Deer Lodge twice. Both times she sent him with documents she'd prepared, organized by argument, with her notes in the margins, marking the points most likely to face challenge. Both times he came back with news that the case was holding. One evening in late October, riding back from the courthouse in the early dark, he found himself thinking about the creek, about the berry brambles that grew along it, heavy in summer and bare now in the cold, about a woman in a dirt-stained dress standing ankle-deep in the water with a basket of blackberries, trembling but holding his gaze. He'd fired a warning shot, and she'd whispered her apology. He thought about how different everything would look right now if he'd simply turned his horse around. The water rights case moved to formal hearing in November, before a territorial circuit judge. It lasted 2 days. Mabel sat in the gallery. She had no formal standing as a party in the case, but she was there, and Jed's eyes found her twice during the proceedings, and both times she gave him a small, steady nod. The judge ruled in Jed's favor on a Friday morning. The spring stayed his, the creek stayed clean. He told her on the porch of the ranch house when she arrived that afternoon, before she'd even dismounted. She sat on Biscuit and looked at him and took a slow breath. "Good," she said. "Good," he said. Hannah appeared in the doorway behind him. "Supper's early," she said. "We're celebrating, and I'm not waiting until dark." They ate together at the kitchen table venison roast, Hannah's good biscuits, preserved blackberry jam from the summer's harvest. They talked about the families on the ridge, about Thomas Briggs, who had this week calculated the correct change from a $2 purchase faster than Mabel could check his work, about the school which needed another shelf. They did not talk about Vance. He would come back. They both knew it. A man who built his empire on other people's resources and other people's limitations did not accept a single legal defeat as a final answer. He would find another angle, another pressure point. But that was not tonight's problem. Tonight's problem was only the biscuits, and the fire, and the particular satisfaction of a fight that had been worth fighting. The harvest ball was Hannah's idea. Mabel hadn't been informed of this fact until she was already committed, having agreed somewhat abstractly in early October, when Hannah mentioned it in passing that yes, she supposed a harvest celebration sounded like a fine thing, and then discovering in November that Hannah had interpreted this as full participation and had in fact already spoken to the fiddle player. "You need to go," Hannah told her, not for the first time, on the afternoon of the ball. "You've been fighting legal battles and teaching fractions for 3 months. You need one evening that isn't either of those things." "I'm not opposed to going," Mabel said. "I simply said I wasn't sure what I'd wear, which is why I did this." Hannah produced, from the back of the bedroom wardrobe, a dress. It was blue wool, a deep, soft blue, somewhere between the color of the autumn sky at 4 in the afternoon and the color of water over flat stone. Simply cut, no excessive ornamentation, but well made with a full skirt and a neckline that was elegant without being impractical. Hannah had tailored it herself over the past 3 weeks in the hours after Mabel left for the day, working from memory, and a piece of string she'd used to take measurements under the guise of helping Mabel hem her riding skirt. Mabel looked at the dress for a moment. "Hannah," she said. "Don't," Hannah said. "Don't make a speech about it. Just put it on." She put it on. The ball was held in the largest building. Bannack had the meeting hall, which was neither large nor particularly grand, but which the town had decorated with corn sheaves and pine boughs, and enough candles to make the log walls glow amber. The fiddle player had brought a friend with a banjo, and the pair of them were already tuning up in the corner when Mabel arrived with Hannah. The room was full. The whole county came to the Harvest Ball ranchers, merchants, miners when they could get away, the school teacher, and her landlady from the boarding house. A cluster of women near the refreshment table looked up when Mabel walked in. She was aware of it in the peripheral way of someone who has learned to track a room without appearing to. She heard the whispers. She had heard whispers like them before, in Boston ballrooms, in church lobbies, in the studied, deliberate way that certain women communicated their assessments of other women's bodies using that particular register of voice that was low enough to suggest privacy, but loud enough to guarantee it carried. Too full-figured, too broad. That dress does her no favors. She had spent 25 years learning to carry herself through that kind of room. She knew how to walk without apology. She did it now, back straight, chin level, moving to the table where the coffee was set, because she wanted coffee, and she was not going to let the weight of other people's smallness keep her from it. Hannah appeared at her elbow. "Ignore them," she said quietly. "I am," Mabel said. And mostly she was. She talked with Clara Briggs, who had come down from the ridge with her husband and looked genuinely happy for the first time since Mabel had known her. She talked with Aldous, the surveyor, who was holding a glass of cider and had strong opinions about the territorial court's filing procedures. She talked with the doctor's wife, who wanted to know about the school and whether Mabel had considered adding a health education component to the curriculum. The music started. Couples moved to the floor. She stood at the edge with her coffee, watching, and then the door opened. She heard it before she saw it, the subtle shift in the room's sound, the slight drop in the murmur of conversation, the particular quality of attention that a room gives to a person when that person has a certain kind of authority. Not political authority, something physical, more present. Jed Westford walked in. She had seen him every day for 3 months in work clothes, canvas trousers, flannel shirts, the worn leather jacket he wore on cold mornings. She had never seen him in a dark velvet vest over a white shirt, with his jaw shaved clean and his dark hair pushed back. He looked like he'd made a real effort and was characteristically unaware of the effect of it, his eyes moving across the room in that habitual scanning way, not performing the entrance at all. The group of whispering women near the refreshment table had gone quiet. He found her in about 3 seconds. He crossed the room, directly, not stopping to speak to anyone, which, in a room this size, required a certain amount of deliberate intention. He came to where she was standing at the edge of the floor and stopped in front of her. The fiddle player struck into the opening notes of a waltz, fast and bright, a real working waltz, the kind that moved. Jed looked at her for a moment. Then he bowed. Low, real, with the serious formality of a man who didn't do things halfway, and held out his hand. The room was watching. She was aware of it completely. All the whispers and the assessments and the careful calibrated cruelty of the women by the refreshment table, all of it was watching this moment, waiting to see what it meant. She looked at his hand, at his face, at the straightforward certainty in his eyes. She took his hand. He brought her onto the floor and swept her into the waltz. She had learned to waltz at 12 from her grandmother's housekeeper, who had grown up in Vienna and held the strong opinion that dancing was a fundamental life skill regardless of where you ended up. It had been years since she'd done it in a real ballroom, but the reflex was still there, the quick recalibration of weight, the read of your partner's lead, the moment when you find the rhythm together. Jed danced the way he did most things, sure-footed, unhurried, with a lead that was clear and confident without being controlling. He gave her room. She took it. The music was fast, and they matched it, and somewhere in the second turn around the floor, her skirt flared wide, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, something close to pure physical joy, not despite her body. In it, in the full, generous, capable fact of it, the strength in her legs and the easy balance and the way the blue wool caught the candlelight as it moved. She was aware that more couples had joined the floor. She was aware that the whispering women were still watching. She was aware of all of it. And dancing anyway. Jed turned her through a corner, and she laughed a real one, surprised out of her by the speed of it. And he grinned, sudden and unguarded. And for a moment, they were just two people who were good at this and doing it together. And that was the whole of the world. The song ended. They were breathless, both of them, and flushed. And she was still holding his hand, and he wasn't moving to let go. Again. Yes, she said. They danced 3 more times. Not all waltzes. There was a reel in there that required considerable improvisational skill from both of them, and which Thomas Briggs, present at the ball with his mother, watched with an expression of pure delight from the side of the room. Between dances, she stood with him, rather than separating to opposite sides of the room, which she noticed the whispering women notice. She didn't change position. He brought her a cup of cider. They talked. He told her about the south pasture fence that needed replacing before deep winter. She told him that Lucy Driscoll had written her first complete sentence that week and had looked at it on the slate for a long moment before carefully erasing it, like she wanted to hold it privately before anyone else saw it. He was quiet for a moment after that. "She'll keep it," he said, "even if she erased it." "I know," Mabel said. The room had loosened around them. The whispers had moved on. There were other things to whisper about, other observations to make, and Mabel Henderson had taken up rather more of the evening's attention than she'd planned, and showed no signs of being appropriately diminished by it, which tended to reduce the enjoyment of the exercise. Clara Briggs appeared at Mabel's shoulder at one point and said quietly, "You looked magnificent out there," then moved on before Mabel could respond. The ball thinned in the late evening, families with children heading home, the candles burning lower. Hannah had gone to talk to someone an hour ago and had been comfortably installed in a corner conversation ever since. Jed touched Mabel's elbow lightly. "Come outside a minute." They slipped out through the side door. The Montana sky at night in November was something she still wasn't entirely prepared for, no matter how many times she saw it. There was no city light for hundreds of miles. The stars were extraordinary, thick and cold, and absolutely indifferent in the best possible way. The Milky Way a broad smear of light across the black, the peaks showing dark and sharp against it. She stopped on the step and looked up. "I grew up in a city," she said. You never see any of it." "I know," he said. He was standing close, not making anything of it, just there in the cold, looking up at the same sky. She lowered her eyes from the stars and found him looking at her. Not at the sky, at her. The night was very quiet. The music from inside was muffled, distant. Their breath made small clouds in the cold. He lifted one hand and touched her face, gently, the rough pad of his thumb against her cheekbone, just for a moment. She went very still, not from surprise, from attention, from paying the fullest possible attention to what was happening. He leaned down and kissed her. It was unhurried, quiet. Like everything about him, nothing wasted, nothing performed, just entirely present and entirely certain. His hand stayed at her face, and she turned into it slightly, naturally, without deciding to. When he pulled back, the cold air was sharp between them. She looked at him. His eyes, in the starlight, were dark and steady. "I've been thinking about that for a while," he said. "I know," she said. He laughed, low and quiet, and pulled her close, and she leaned against his shoulder and looked back up at the unreasonable stars over the Montana peaks, and thought about how very far she'd come from Boston, and how exactly right this cold, dark canyon felt, and how sometimes a wrong turn and a warning shot and a pair of boots could change the entire architecture of a life. Inside, the fiddle player launched into one more reel. Inside, Hannah would be looking for them in about 10 minutes. For now, there was just the sky and the cold and the man beside her who had never once in 4 months suggested that she take up less space. She had absolutely no intention of doing so. December came early that year. The first real snow fell in the last week of November, and by the time December settled in properly, the canyon was white from wall to wall, and the trails over the ridge had hardened into something between ice and iron. Mabel rode them anyway. She'd learned the footing, learned which sections stayed passable, and which ones you needed to pick around, and Biscuit had learned them too. They made a reliable pair, the two of them, the gray mare and the Boston schoolteacher, moving through the cold each morning like it was simply the arrangement, and always had been. The school was warm. Jed had built a good stove, fitted in October, before the first frost, and it threw heat into the small room with a generous efficiency that made the log walls feel almost snug. The children came every morning now, 10, sometimes 11, occasionally 12, when the Hendricks family sent their oldest down from the North Claim. They came in cold-cheeked and loud and settled into their benches and became something else entirely. Focused. Present. Mabel had watched it happen enough times that it still moved her every time. That specific transformation from outdoor child to thinking person, the moment when a student's eyes stopped moving around the room and went inward, following a problem. Thomas Briggs had moved on to long division. He worked through problems with a speed that occasionally made her check his arithmetic twice, not from doubt, but from the simple difficulty of keeping up. Lucy Driscoll was reading full paragraphs now, slow and careful, tracking each word with a small finger, but reading. The boy from the Northern Claim, whose name was Peter, and who had arrived in September with the forward-leaning attention of someone starved. For exactly, this Peter had become Thomas's informal competition and Thomas's informal best friend simultaneously, which produced a productive intensity in the front two benches that Mabel had learned to channel rather than suppress. It was Peter who brought the rock. Tuesday morning, in early December, the students came in from the cold in their usual noisy cluster, shedding coats, claiming benches. Peter came in last, and he was quieter than usual. He sat down and didn't immediately open his slate. He was turning something over in his hands, a rock, dark and irregular, about the size of a large egg. Mabel noticed but didn't address it immediately. She started the morning with reading, moving through the rows, listening to each child work through their passage. By the time she came to Peter, he'd set the rock on the bench beside him and was holding his reader, but his eyes kept going back to it. "Peter," she said, "what have you got there?" He looked up, then at the rock. "Found it in my pa's jacket pocket," he said. "Don't know what it is. It smells funny." She held out her hand. He gave it to her. It was heavier than it looked. Dark gray, almost black in places, with a surface that was slightly oily to the touch despite being cold and dry. She turned it over, looked at the texture, brought it close and smelled it. She knew that smell. She had read about it in her father's library, in a volume on mineral extraction that she'd worked through at 16 because it was next to a legal text she'd already finished. She had read about it in the context of irresponsible industrial practice, the particular problem of certain mining operations that generated sulfide-bearing waste material. When that material entered a water supply, it didn't just make the water taste bad, it made it dangerous. The chemistry was specific and well documented by the time she'd read about it, and what she was holding had the exact density, texture, and smell of sulfide-rich ore processing waste. She set the rock on her desk. "Where did you find this in your father's pocket?" she said. Her voice was careful. "Classroom steady." "Back inside pocket," Peter said. "He came home with it last week. I thought it was interesting. Do you know where your father found it?" Peter shook his head. "He doesn't talk much about the shaft." She looked at the rock for a moment. Then she looked at the class 10 children, watching her with the attentive curiosity of students who had learned that when Miss Henderson looked at something with that particular expression, it was worth paying attention to. "All right," she said. "We're going to do a lesson in mineral identification. But first reading." Peter. Please start from the top of page 14. After school, she kept the rock. She wrapped it in a piece of cloth and put it in her bag and rode directly to the ranch. Jed was in the barn when she arrived, and she waited in the kitchen with Hannah, turning the wrapped rock over in her hands. Hannah watched her and said nothing, which was Hannah's way of saying she could see this was serious. He came in from the barn and stopped when he saw her face. She unwrapped the rock on the kitchen table. Peter Hendricks brought this to school today, she said. He found it in his father's jacket. Peter's father works the Vance shaft, she paused. This is sulfide ore processing waste. When it enters a water source, any water source, creek, well, spring, it produces sulfuric acid through oxidation. It poisons the water. Not quickly enough to be obvious immediately, but consistently and cumulatively. She looked at him. It kills fish first. Then it gets into the soil around the bank. Then, if the exposure continues, it becomes dangerous for livestock and people. Jed looked at the rock. His face was very still. You're certain, he said. I'm certain enough that we need to test the lower creek water immediately, she said. And I need to find out if Vance is dumping this waste upstream. Why would he dump it in the creek? Jed said. He has the mine operation to manage, because proper waste disposal costs money, she said. And if he can move the waste to the creek at night quietly, without documentation, he cuts his operating costs significantly. And she looked at him steadily. If the water downstream becomes unreliable over the next year, ranchers start having trouble. Livestock health problems, unusable wells. People sell and move on. Jed was quiet. It's a second play, she said. He lost the water rights challenge. This is how he accomplishes the same result through a different door. Hannah had turned from the stove. She was looking at the rock on the table with an expression that had gone past concern into something older and harder. The family's on the ridge, she said. They drink from the lower creek. Yes, Mabel said. Their children drink from it. Yes. The kitchen was very quiet. Jed picked up the rock. He turned it over once, set it back down. What do we need to prove it? He said. Water samples from the lower creek, tested by someone with the scientific knowledge to identify the contamination markers, she said. And evidence connecting the waste material to Vance's operation specifically, which means comparing this sample to the ore profile from his mine. If they match, the source is clear. She straightened. I can do the water testing. I have enough chemistry knowledge for the basic markers. The ore comparison will need an assayer or a mining engineer. There's an assayer in Billings, he said. Same man who did the survey work. Can we trust him? Yes, he said simply. She nodded. Get him. And in the meantime, don't let the Ridge families use the lower creek section until we know what's in it. I'll ride tomorrow morning, he said. Good. She reached for her bag, then stopped. Jed, Vance will find out we're testing. This kind of thing doesn't stay quiet. He met her eyes. I know. When he does, she said. He'll move quickly. He's not a man who waits when he's cornered. Neither am I, Jed said. She collected water samples the next morning before school, alone in the gray pre-dawn cold, filling 3 glass jars from different points along the lower creek section. She labeled them carefully, wrapped them in cloth, stored them in the cold cellar at the ranch where the temperature would stay consistent. She taught that day as though nothing had changed, because for the children in her schoolroom, nothing had yet. Thomas worked through division. Peter read his passage carefully and didn't ask about the rock, though she could see the question in his eyes. Lucy Driscoll wrote 3 complete sentences, unprompted, then looked at them and didn't erase them this time. That was the part of the day Mabel held on to. She ran the water tests in the evening's simple chemistry, the kind her father's library had prepared her for, watching the reaction markers in the lamplight while Hannah sat nearby with her mending and asked occasional practical questions that told Mabel she was following the process carefully. The results came in on Thursday, clear and consistent across all 3 samples. Sulfide contamination, early stage, but unmistakable. She was writing up the documentation when she heard a horse in the yard, late past 8, the dark complete outside the kitchen windows. Jed had been away since morning, riding the ranch boundaries, checking the cattle in the lower pastures. He came in and she showed him the results without preamble. He read them. Read them again. It's him, Jed said. It's consistent with his operation, she said carefully. The assayer confirmation will make it definitive. But yes, the probability is this is Vance. He set the papers down. He stood at the counter with both hands flat on the wood, looking at the wall. Those families, he said. The Briggs family, the Driscoll children. They're not severely exposed yet, she said. The contamination is early. If we stop it now, the creek will clear, she paused. But it has to be now, not next month. He turned from the counter. His face had settled into the particular expression she'd learned to read. Over the past months, not anger exactly, though the anger was there underneath it. Something more controlled, more purposeful. I'll have the assayer back within the week, he said. He did. Aldous, the assayer, arrived on a Thursday and spent 2 days on the creek and at the mine public perimeter. And when he was done, he sat at Jed's kitchen table and laid out his findings with the quiet precision of a man who understood the weight of what he was saying. The ore sample from Peter Hendricks's father's jacket matched the geochemical profile of the Vance shaft operation. The waste material in the creek was consistent with the byproduct of Vance's ore crushing process. The dumping pattern, based on sediment distribution, suggested it had been happening for at least 6 weeks. Mabel had the documentation organized before Aldous had finished speaking. She had a legal brief drafted by Friday Morning Specific, sourced, referencing the relevant territorial statutes on water contamination and the public health provisions she'd found in the same legislative appendix that had saved Jed's water rights. They were preparing to file on Saturday morning. On Friday evening, Sheriff Cole came to the ranch. She was at the kitchen table when he arrived. Hannah behind her, the brief spread before them. She heard Jed's voice on the porch, and then the lower, smoother voice of the sheriff. And she read the tone of it before she heard the words. She gathered the papers quickly, folded them, handed the stack to Hannah, who took it without a word and moved toward the back of the house. Jed came in with the sheriff behind him. Cole was a wide-shouldered man with a careful face and eyes that moved over a room, the way Vance's eyes moved, calculating what was useful and what was a problem. She had met him twice. Both times she'd come away with the clear impression of a man who had made a specific arrangement with his own conscience and found it satisfactory. He looked at her, at the table, at the lamp. "Miss Henderson," he said, "I have a warrant." She looked at Jed. Jed's face was stone. "On what charge?" she said. "Inciting a labor disruption," the sheriff said. "Several miners have ceased work at the Vance shaft this week. Mr. Vance states that your educational activities have been used to encourage the men to strike." She looked at him steadily. "I teach children," she said. "Whatever the miners have decided about their own working conditions is their business, not mine." "The warrant has been issued," he said. "You'll need to come with me." "This is a fabricated charge," Jed said. His voice was completely flat. "And you know it." "I'm executing a legal warrant," Cole said. He didn't look at Jed, kept his eyes on Mabel. She stood up from the table. She looked at Jed. His jaw was hard. His hands were at his sides, and she could see the effort in the stillness of them. "Don't," she said quietly, just to him, clear enough that only he heard it. "Get the assayer. Get the filing done. That's what matters." He held her gaze. Every muscle in his face was working against itself. She turned to the sheriff. "I'll come," she said, "under protest and with full intention of contesting this warrant the moment a circuit judge is available." "Noted," Cole said, with the pleasantness of a man who expected this and had already been told it wouldn't matter. They rode out into the dark, and 3 hours later, the sky in the north went the color of old pewter, and the wind changed, and the first true blizzard of the season came rolling off the high peaks like a wall. Vance's message arrived at the ranch before midnight. A rider, one of his men, brought it to the front door and didn't wait for a response. Jed read it by lamplight at the kitchen table, Hannah standing behind him. The message was brief. Drop the water rights lawsuit, or she freezes to death in that cell before the storm clears. Hannah read it over his shoulder. Her face went tight and old. Jed set the note down on the table. He looked at it for a moment, at the words on it, at the deliberate casualness of the handwriting, the confidence of a man who had never in his life written a threat he didn't believe he could deliver. Outside, the wind had reached a pitch that made the window glass vibrate in its frames. The temperature was dropping fast. The Bannock jail was a log building solid enough in normal weather, but the cell in the back had a small iron stove that depended on someone choosing to feed it. Whether anyone would choose to feed it tonight, with Vance's men watching the sheriff's choices, was not a question that left much room for optimism. He stood up. "Hannah," he said, "wake Eli and Cord, his two ranch hands. Tell them to saddle up and dress for a bad night." Hannah was already moving toward the bunkhouse door. He folded the note and put it in his coat pocket. He went to the gun rack. He took down his rifle and checked the load, put on his heaviest coat, his good gloves, his hat, with the wide brim that would keep the snow off his face. He thought about a woman in a creek, trembling, but holding her eyes steady. He thought about her voice at the kitchen table, going through land law by lamplight, and the scratch of her pencil in the margins of documents that had saved this ranch. He thought about her face in the blizzard dark, riding away with the sheriff, and the quiet, entirely certain way she'd told him what mattered. "Don't. Get the assayer. Get the filing done. That's what matters." He put on his hat. "I know what matters," he said to the empty kitchen. "I'm coming to get both." The blizzard hit Bannock before midnight. Snow drove horizontal down the main street, thick and hard, reducing visibility to the length of an arm. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours. The few buildings with light in their windows looked like distant stars present, but barely, and giving no warmth to the space between them. Mabel sat on the narrow bench at the back of the jail cell and looked at the iron stove in the corner. It had gone cold an hour ago. The deputy who'd been tending it, a young man named Willis, who had the uncomfortable expression of someone doing a job he wasn't proud of, had been replaced at the watch by two men she didn't recognize. Vance's men, almost certainly. They'd come in around 10 o'clock, spoken quietly to Willis, and Willis had left without tending the stove and without meeting her eyes. She pulled her coat tighter. The cold was serious. She understood that. Montana blizzard cold was a different order of cold than anything she'd experienced in Boston. It came through walls, through clothing, through the simple fact of inactivity, and it had an agenda that a Boston winter never quite managed. She was not going to panic. Panic was expensive, thermally and cognitively, and she didn't have the reserves to spend on it. She thought instead. She had the draft legal brief memorized. She'd written most of it herself. And she had the memory for text that most people who spent their childhoods reading in their father's library developed. If the physical document was safe with Hannah, the argument was still intact in her head. Whatever happened tonight, the case wasn't lost. She thought about Peter Hendricks's father, working a 12-hour shaft shift for Vance's scrip wages, bringing home in his jacket pocket the evidence of what was being done to the water his family drank. The man probably hadn't known what the rock meant. He'd picked it up the way a person picks something interesting, pocketed it, and forgotten it. His son had found it and brought it to a schoolroom, the way children bring things they find interesting to the person they trust to explain the world. That was what a school was for. That was exactly what it was for. She looked at the two guards. They were seated near the front of the room, away from her cell, talking to each other in low voices. Both large, both wearing Vance Company gear under their coats, the particular heavy canvas work jackets that Vance issued to his men in lieu of fair wages. She knew their families. Not them, personally, but she knew the Mine families. She'd been teaching their children for 3 months. She'd ridden to their cabins, spoken with their wives, watched their sons and daughters bend over slates with that particular focused hunger that told you a mind was finally getting what it needed. "Excuse me," she said. The two men turned. "How long have you worked the Vance shaft?" she asked. They looked at each other. The older one, heavyset with a dark beard, turned back to her. "Long enough," he said. "And it's not your business. Do you have children?" she said. A pause. "What's that to you?" "I'm the school teacher," she said. "I've been teaching the Ridge children since September. I want to know if any of them are yours." The younger one, lean, red-haired, considerably less comfortable in his chair, said nothing, but his jaw had shifted slightly. "The reason I ask," she said, and her voice was even, unhurried, the same voice she used when she was about to explain something important in the classroom, and wanted it to actually land, "is that I need you to understand what you're doing tonight. Not for my sake, for theirs. Doing our job," the older one said. "You're guarding a school teacher who has scientific proof that Sterling Vance has been dumping toxic ore waste into the creek your families drink from," she said. "The water your wives cook with. The water your children drink every day." Silence. The wind pushed against the building. The stove sat cold in the corner. "I tested the water myself," she said. "An independent assayer confirmed the contamination. Sulfide waste from Vance's crusher. 6 weeks of it, at minimum, going directly into the lower creek. That's not opinion. That's documented fact." The red-haired man had stopped looking at the wall. "You're saying he's poisoning the water," the older one said. "I'm saying the chemistry is unambiguous. And the source has been confirmed," she said. "I'm saying that at its current rate of contamination, the lower creek becomes genuinely dangerous for human consumption within a few months. I'm saying that your children have been drinking it." She paused. "And I'm saying that the documentation to stop it is already written and ready to file, and I am sitting in this cell tonight specifically so that Mr. Vance can prevent that from happening." The room was very quiet. The blizzard pressed at the walls. "He said you were causing trouble," the older guard said. But his voice had changed. "Less certain, he said miners' kids only need pickaxes, not books," she said. "He said that. In a room full of children. I was there." She looked directly at him. "Is that the man whose orders you're following tonight?" The red-haired man stood up. He stood up without making a statement of it, just came to his feet and walked to the stove and began building a fire in it. The older man watched him, looked at Mabel, looked at the wall. He didn't stop him. Outside, the blizzard was indifferent to human drama. It came down in solid curtains, the kind of snow that had weight and direction and intent, filling the street ruts and burying the porch rails and making the distance between buildings feel oceanic. The temperature kept dropping. In this kind of weather, a man who didn't know the trail stayed still. A man who knew it and had good reason could still move. Jed Westford knew the trail to Bannock better than he knew most things in his life. He rode with Eli and Cord, flanking him, all three of them heads down into the wind, the horses steady and unhappy but moving. Jed had brought Calhoun the big bay, the one who'd carried an exhausted woman home from the creek on a summer afternoon, and who had the temperament of a horse that had decided years ago that his rider's decisions were probably reasonable. Hannah had not ridden with them. He'd told her to stay, and she had, which told him she understood what he expected to find in Bannock, and was trusting him to handle it. She'd handed him an extra blanket without a word and gone back inside. He thought about the ride, planned what came next with the deliberate focus he'd learned in the war, breaking the problem into pieces, deciding the order, not spending attention on anything that wasn't the next piece. The town came into view as dark shapes in the white, the few lit windows, the jail at the end of the main street, light visible inside. He tied Calhoun at the rail furthest from the jail entrance, where the overhang kept some of the snow off. Eli and Cord came up beside him. "Eli," he said, Watch the horses in the south door. Cord, come with me. They moved through the snow. He pushed the jail door open. The scene inside was not what he'd expected. The two guards were not, as he'd anticipated, positioned between him and the cell. One was at the stove, feeding wood into a fire that was just beginning to take hold. The other was sitting on his bench with his arms on his knees, looking at the floor with the expression of a man reassessing something significant. Mabel was standing at the cell door. She looked at Jed, looked at the guard by the stove, looked back at Jed. The stove went out, she said. It's been addressed. He looked at the two guards. The red-haired one at the stove kept his back to him. The older one finally looked up, and his expression had the complicated quality of a man who has recently made a decision he's still working out the implications of. "Where's Cole?" Jed said. "Back room," the older guard said. "Sleeping. Wake him." The guard went. Cord stood at the door. The fire in the stove was catching. Now Jed could hear it beginning to breathe. Cole came out from the back room with his coat, half on, bleary, and then immediately less bleary when he saw Jed Westford standing in his jail. "I want her out of that cell," Jed said. The warrant is a fabrication, and you know it," Jed said. "And I have a signed statement from an independent assayer documenting that Sterling Vance has been dumping sulfide waste into the public creek for 6 weeks, which is a territorial criminal offense. So you can hold a schoolteacher on a false incitement charge, or you can explain to a circuit judge why you helped Vance cover up a public health crime." He reached into his coat and put the assayer's documentation on Cole's desk. "Your choice. Make it tonight." Cole looked at the documents, looked at the cell, looked at the two guards, the one who'd woken the stove, and the one who was still looking at his boots. He was doing the arithmetic. Jed could see it, calculating whose power was more immediate, whose consequences were more certain, which side of this was going to look better when the storm cleared and the circuit judge came around. It was a long moment. Cole picked up his keys. He unlocked the cell door. Mabel walked out. She moved past Cole without looking at him, past Jed's outstretched hand to take the blanket from his arm, wrapping it around herself in the practical way of someone who had been very cold and was now addressing that as a priority. Jed looked at the older guard. "What are your children's names?" he said. The guard looked up, surprised. "What? Your children. What are their names?" A pause. "May and Samuel," he said. 9 and 7. They ever come to the school on the ridge?" The man shook his head slowly. "Didn't know if we were, if it was for us." "It's for them," Mabel said, from inside the blanket. Her voice was steady, warmed by the certainty of it, if nothing else. "Both of them. Tell them to come Monday." The man looked at her. Something moved through his face that was more complicated than any single word would cover. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Jed put his hand on her back, not gripping, just present, and guided her toward the door. Cord pulled it open. The blizzard came in cold and immediate and entirely honest, which, after the last several hours, felt almost like relief. She stopped on the porch step and turned her face into the wind for a moment. Snow on her eyelashes, the cold hitting the warmth of the blanket. "The filing," she said. "Hannah has it," he said. "It goes to the circuit court the moment the storm clears." She nodded. Her jaw was tight from cold, but her eyes were clear. He pulled her into the shelter of his arm, away from the worst of the wind, because it was practical, and because she was cold, and because he was not pretending otherwise. She leaned into it, practical and real, and not pretending either. Eli had the horses ready. They mounted, and Calhoun moved into the blizzard, with the steady unhappiness of a very good horse doing a difficult thing. And behind them, the jail's lit window receded into the white. The wind came from the north, hard and sustained. The trail home was the kind of riding that required complete attention, both hands, and a working relationship with your horse, built on genuine mutual respect. She rode beside him through the dark and the snow, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying yet. The storm was loud enough to cover everything anyway. They rode with their heads down and their trust in the horses, and the miles going by under the hooves one at a time. Sometime after the canyon, she called to him over the wind. "Jed." He looked across. She was looking at him from inside her coat collar, snow on her hat brim, face red with cold. "Two of Vance's own guards chose the right side tonight," she said, "because they understood what was at stake for their families." He waited. "That's what education does," she said. "It doesn't just teach the children. It changes what the parents can see." He looked at her for a moment, the blizzard between them, the horses steady underneath. "I know," he said. She nodded once and turned back to the trail. The ranch lights came into view 40 minutes later, warm and certain, in the white dark, and Hannah was in the doorway before they'd crossed the yard, lantern in hand, her face moving from taut to released when she saw them both on horseback. They came inside, out of the cold and the storm, and the particular kind of night that changes what comes after it. Vance's regime had not ended cleanly or completely, but it had cracked, and both of them knew that a crack, properly applied, was how you brought down a wall. The storm cleared on a Sunday. It left behind a world remade in white, the canyon walls sheeted with ice, the creek frozen at its edges, the pine trees heavy and silent under their loads. The sky that came after was the particular blue that only appears after a Montana blizzard, deep and cold and absolutely clear, like the storm had scoured the air down to something essential. By Monday morning, word had moved through the valley the way word always moved in small frontier communities, fast, and without needing any single person to carry it deliberately. People knew that Mabel Henderson had been jailed. People knew that Jed Westford had ridden through a blizzard to get her out. And people knew, though the specifics were still assembling themselves into a coherent shape, that something had been done to the creek. The filing went to the circuit court Monday afternoon. Jed wrote it there himself, the documents in an oilskin case inside his coat, the trail hard and bright under Calhoun's hooves. The circuit judge, a man named Harlan Pruitt, had a reputation in the territory for two things: absolute impartiality and a complete intolerance for the abuse of legal process. He received the filing, read the assayer's documentation, read Mabel's brief, and issued a summons to Sterling Vance before the end of the day. The trial was set for Friday, open air in the town square, because the meeting hall couldn't hold the number of people Pruitt expected to attend, and because Pruitt had a philosophical preference for public proceedings in cases that affected the public. He wasn't wrong about the attendance. By Friday morning, every person in the valley who could get to Bannack had gotten there. Ranchers, miners, ridge families, merchants. Clara Briggs stood near the front with her husband. The Driscoll family came, including the father, who had said never and now stood with his hat in his hands, and his jaw set in the expression of a man who has recently been forced to substantially revise his understanding of events. Thomas Briggs stood on a wagon wheel spoke to see over the adults. Peter Hendricks was beside him. Vance arrived with 3 lawyers. He wore his best coat. His face held its usual arrangement of composed authority. But there was something underneath it, a tightness around the eyes, a precision to his movements that told anyone paying attention that he understood the ground had shifted. Jed stood to the left of the open space they designated as proceedings area. Mabel stood beside him. She wore her good blue wool dress. Hannah had pressed it the night before without being asked, and the leather boots that had walked 11 miles and planed wood floors and ridden through blizzards. Her hair was up. Her hands were still. Judge Pruitt called the proceedings to order from a wooden platform they'd built up from borrowed lumber. He was a lean, gray man with wire spectacles and a voice that carried without effort. The territory's case was presented first, the assayer's findings, the water sample results, the geochemical match between the creek contamination and the Vance shaft ore profile. Aldous gave his testimony with the quiet precision of a man who dealt in facts and had no interest in dressing them up. He cited measurements, concentrations, the specific oxidation chemistry of sulfide waste in moving water. Vance's lead lawyer, a man named Fellows, cross-examined with the polished aggression of someone who charged significant fees. He challenged the methodology. He questioned the chain of custody for the samples. He suggested that natural geological processes could produce similar results, which was technically possible and practically absurd given the documented evidence, and which Aldous dismantled so efficiently that a low murmur of appreciation went through the crowd. Then Fellows turned his attention to Mabel. She had been called to provide context testimony, the chain of events that had led to the discovery, beginning with Peter Hendrick's rock. She gave it clearly, in order, without editorializing. Fellows listened with the attentive patience of someone, waiting for the moment he intended to use. When she finished, he stepped forward. "Miss Henderson," he said, "you present yourself as a credible scientific witness. But let us be direct with this court." He opened his hands toward the crowd in a gesture that managed to include everyone while speaking to no one specifically. "Why should we listen to an oversized, unwomanly spinster from the East?"
The square went absolutely silent.
Not the silence of agreement.
The silence of a crowd that has heard something and is collectively deciding what to do with it. Jed's jaw went hard. He took one step forward.
Mabel put her hand on his arm briefly, lightly. He stopped. She turned to face the crowd. All of it, the ranchers and miners and Ridge families, the merchants and Clara Briggs and Thomas on his wagon spoke, and Peter beside him, and Lucy Driscoll's small face somewhere in the middle of it all. She stood straight. "Mr. Fellows has asked why you should listen to me," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried. "Let me give you the answer he didn't intend." She paused. "Not because of my credentials, not because of where I came from, or what I look like, or whether my figure meets the approval of Sterling Vance's legal team." Another pause. "You should listen because the facts are the facts. The chemistry is documented. The contamination is real. And every family in this valley who has drunk from that creek in the past 6 weeks has been drinking what Mr. Vance put there." She turned slightly, addressing the crowd now rather than the lawyer. "Dignity and intellect are not measured by a person's weight or gender," she said. "Every human being in this territory, from the poorest miner to the youngest child, has a fundamental right to clean water, honest work, and the freedom to learn." She let that sit for a moment. That is not opinion. That is the basis of every legitimate society that has ever attempted to call itself just. Mr. Vance understands this, which is why his strategy has been to attack the messenger rather than address the evidence. She turned back to Pruitt. "The evidence speaks for itself," she said. "I simply delivered it." Fellows was already talking, objecting, pivoting, trying to recover the moment. But the moment was gone. The crowd had made its collective judgment with the swift certainty of people who recognized truth when they heard it, because they'd been living inside the lie it corrected. Pruitt heard 2 more hours of testimony. He asked precise, pointed questions. He read sections of the documentation himself, on the platform, in front of everyone, which was an act of public accountability that Vance's legal team had not anticipated and could not counter. He delivered his ruling in the late afternoon, with the sun dropping behind the western ridge and the cold coming back into the air. Sterling Vance and his mining operation were found in violation of territorial public health statutes. The creek contamination was to be remediated at Vance's expense. The dumping was to cease immediately, under penalty of criminal prosecution. The false charges against Mabel Henderson were dismissed with a formal notation in the record that they had been filed in bad faith to obstruct a legitimate public health investigation. Sheriff Cole was removed from his position, pending a separate inquiry. Vance stood very still while Pruitt read. His lawyers were writing. His face had the particular quality of a man who had miscalculated and was already working out what came next. He would work out something men like Vance always did. He had money and connections. and a fundamental belief in his own eventual prevailing. But he was led away from the square in the company of two federal marshals, and as he went, the crowd that parted for him was not the crowd that had stepped aside for him 6 months ago. These were people who had seen a set of facts laid out in public, clearly and without flinching, what they now understood about their water, their wages, and who had been protecting, whose interests couldn't be unknown. Thomas Briggs, from his wagon spoke, watched Vance walk past. Then he looked at Mabel. He didn't shout. He just nodded, the serious, deliberate nod of an 11-year-old who had decided something important. She nodded back. Spring came to the ridge in April, and with it the smell of thaw pine resin and cold mud, and the first tentative green pushing through the south-facing slopes where the snow retreated first. Jed started building in May, not the cabin school that stood and served and would keep serving. He was building something new, something permanent. Stone walls from the quarry on the eastern ridge, mortar mixed and laid in courses that would outlast both of them. Good timber framing, a real slate roof, not shingles, south-facing windows, generous ones, cut to let in the maximum of Montana's particular light. He built it on the Berry Ridge, exactly there on the flat ground above the creek bend, where the blackberry brambles grew thickest, where a path wound down to the water, and the cottonwoods stood silver-barked on the bank, where a woman had stood in the shallows on a summer afternoon and whispered her apology into the canyon wind. He didn't explain this to anyone. He didn't need to. Hannah knew, and when Mabel rode out one morning in May and stood at the base of the ridge looking up at the stonework going up, she was very quiet for a long time. Then she said, "The windows need to face southeast in the main room. Morning light is better for reading than afternoon." "Already planned," he said. She looked at him. "You measured for it last fall," he said, "while we were doing the water rights work." She was quiet again, looking at the walls, going up the careful, patient work of a man who had decided something and was seeing it through one stone at a time. "How long?" she said. "September," he said, "for the school. The rest, there's a second room in the plan. Living quarters." He looked at her steadily. "That part depends on you." She held his gaze. "Ask me properly," she said. He had been working up to this for months. She probably knew that. She knew most things. But she was right that it deserved to be done properly, and he agreed with her, and so he set down the level he was holding and came down from the foundation course and stood in front of her on the ridge with the canyon behind them and the May sun on the stone and asked her properly. She said yes before he'd finished the sentence. He smiled. The real one, the one that changed his face entirely. She'd been collecting those smiles since the first time she'd seen it, in the harvest ball firelight, and she had not gotten tired of any of them. "Good," he said, and picked up his level and went back to work. She laughed. The wedding was on Christmas Day. Hannah had wanted June for the flowers. Mabel had wanted December, for the reason that it was the heart of the school year, and the children could attend, and she wanted the children there. Jed had said Christmas specifically, because it was already a day people associated with good things, and adding their marriage to the list of associations seemed efficient. Efficiency had carried the argument. They married inside the stone schoolroom, which smelled of pine smoke and new wood, and the particular clean cold of a Montana December. The windows let in the flat winter light, silver white, falling across the new desks and the long slate board and the bookshelves Jed had built along the north wall, already holding the volumes Mabel had ordered from publishers in Boston and Chicago and St. Louis books on history, mathematics, natural science, literature, geography. Clara Briggs had made preserves for the celebration. The Hendricks family brought venison. Hannah had been cooking for 3 days. Every family from the ridge was there. Thomas Briggs sat in the front row and looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone mentally cataloging the construction quality. Peter Hendricks sat beside him. Lucy Driscoll, who was now reading chapter books, sat with her mother and father, both of them, The father quiet and present, in the way of a man who had learned some things the hard way and was not making the same mistakes twice. Two children Mabel hadn't taught yet sat in the back row with their grandmother, the Aldous grandchildren, from a family who'd moved in from the North Claim in October. She'd already been to see them. They'd start in January. Judge Pruitt performed the ceremony, which was a coincidence of territory law and geography, rather than anyone's sentiment, though Mabel privately thought it was fitting that the same man who had read justice into a public record was now reading their vows into one. She wore ivory wool. Hannah had made it, quietly and over months, from fabric she'd ordered in August without saying what it was for. It was simply cut and beautifully fitted, with a full skirt and long sleeves, and a collar of cream-colored lace that had been her mother's, and that she'd kept in a cedar box through all the years and all the miles, because some things you carry forward, even when you're not sure yet what you're carrying them toward. She looked radiant. This was not a complicated observation. Everyone in the room made it within 30 seconds of seeing her, and several of them said it aloud, and she received the words with the direct, clear-eyed grace of a woman who had spent enough time being told her appearance was inadequate, that genuine appreciation had become easy to recognize and accept. Jed wore his dark vest, his good shirt. He'd shaved that morning with unusual care, which Hannah had noticed and said nothing about, which was its own form of commentary. He held her hands at the front of the schoolroom. His hands were rough from 6 months of stonework. Hers had chalk dust in the creases that no amount of washing fully removed. Both pairs were steady. Pruitt read the words. They said the words back. And then Jed held her hands a moment longer before the ring, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded attention he'd always given things that mattered to him. And he said what he'd been thinking about saying since approximately October, when he'd first understood clearly that what he felt was going to require more precision than he usually allowed himself. "I promise to be the shoulder you lean on when you're tired, May," he said. "But more than that, I promise to always stand behind you, supporting your wings and your passion for teaching." The room was very quiet. She looked at him. Steady, clear, completely present. "I know," she said, softly. "I know you will." He put the ring on her finger. Pruitt said the final words. Hannah, in the second row, looked at the ceiling briefly. Thomas Briggs started clapping first. The rest of the room followed. Outside, the December sky was the deep blue of a Montana winter at noon, and the snow on the ridge lay clean and white, and the stone schoolhouse stood solid on the berry ground, with smoke coming from its chimney in a straight, unhurried line. 10 years later, the berry brambles still came back every summer, reliable and heavy, running thick along the creek bank in the heat of July. The blackberries were always best in the second week of August, and every year Mabel picked them in the early morning before the school day started. Her basket the same woven one she'd carried the summer she'd crossed the wrong canyon and arrived, trespassing and terrified and entirely certain, at the edge of a creek on a stranger's land. She wasn't terrified anymore. The ridge had changed around them, the way living places do, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulated layers of 10 years of people building something together. There were 12 families on the western slope now, instead of 7. The mine was still operating, under new management, since Vance had eventually exhausted his legal options and his investors' patience simultaneously, in that order. The new manager was a quiet man from Colorado who paid wages in actual currency and disposed of his processing waste in the manner required by territorial law. The schoolhouse on the Berry Ridge had expanded twice. First in 1882, a reading room added to the east end. Then in 1885, a second classroom, because the enrollment had grown to 34 students, and one teacher, even one, with Mabel Henderson Westford's particular efficiency, could only do so much with 34 minds simultaneously demanding attention. She'd trained an assistant teacher the previous fall, a young woman named Ruth from a mining family who had come up through Mabel's own classroom, class of 1,884, and who had the gift for it, the specific patience and genuine curiosity that you couldn't manufacture in a person, but could recognize and develop if you were paying attention. The school served children of every background the valley held. Miners, children, ranch children, children from the two new homestead families who'd come out from Illinois the year before. A pair of brothers whose grandmother had come west on the Oregon Trail and who had names that mixed her original language with their English fathers. They sat in the second row and were fiercely competitive about mathematics in a way that kept the whole class sharp. Mabel had never once charged a family a fee. She had also, over 10 years, quietly and without making a program of it, connected graduating students with apprenticeships, with correspondence courses, with every opportunity she could locate or create within the reach of the territory. Thomas Briggs was apprenticed to an engineer in Helena at 17. Peter Hendricks was studying law, a fact that gave Mabel a specific satisfaction she didn't try to articulate because it was too large and too layered to reduce to a sentence. Lucy Driscoll was teaching at the new school in the county seat, which she'd helped establish, and which used the same 3 words Mabel had written on the Berry Ridge blackboard in 1,878. Read, think, build. The ranch was thriving. Jed had expanded the cattle operation in 1,881 and brought on 2 additional hands. The water rights registration was iron solid, reinforced by the territorial court's 1,878 ruling, and the spring still ran clean and cold through the eastern boundary. The kitchen garden was Hannah's now. She'd officially claimed it years ago, and nobody had argued. Hannah was 65 and showed no intention of slowing down. She had strong opinions about the garden and the kitchen and the 3 Westford children, and expressed these opinions freely, which everyone in the household had come to rely on the way they relied on the mountain weather, present, sometimes severe, always honest. The children were 8, 6, and 3. The eldest, a daughter, was named after Jed's mother. She had her father's eyes and her mother's precise, searching way of looking at problems, and she had been reading since she was 4, which no one in the family found surprising. The middle one, a son, was quieter, more watchful, already showing the practical bent that would probably take him toward ranch work or engineering he had recently, and methodically taken apart the kitchen clock to determine how it worked, reassembled it correctly, and presented it to Hannah with an expression of complete satisfaction. The youngest was still mostly interested in the dog. All 3 of them attended the Berry Ridge School. On an August evening in 1,888, the sun went down behind the canyon in the way it did in late summer, slow and enormous, turning the peaks from gold to copper to rose, the shadows lengthening across the ridge in long purple bars, while the sky above stayed light for another half hour after the sun itself disappeared. Jed and Mabel stood on the Berry Ridge above the creek. Below them, the stone schoolhouse was quiet, the students gone for the day, Ruth locking up the reading room. The smoke from the chimney had thinned to almost nothing. The kitchen garden at the ranch below showed green in the last light. The canyon held the warmth of the day a little longer than the peaks, and the creek made its sound, the same sound it had always made, the same water moving over the same stones. The blackberries were ripe. Mabel was holding a handful of them, the juice already on her fingers, the way it always was in August. She looked at the stain on her hand for a moment, looked at the ridge, the school, the creek bend where the cottonwoods stood. She had come a long way from the woman who'd stood in this creek whispering apologies. She knew that. She thought about it sometimes not with nostalgia exactly, but with the particular clarity that comes from having lived through the distance between who you were and who you became. She had come here with nothing but her mind and her refusal, and a basket. She had found clean water and a warning shot, and a man who had looked at her and seen her worth before he'd learned her name. Jed was standing beside her with his arms crossed, looking at the same view. He was 42, and the years showed on him the way good years do, in the depth of his eyes, the ease of his posture, the complete absence of any need to prove himself to anyone. Thomas wrote from Helena, she said. The engineering project is going well. He thinks he'll have his certification by spring. Good, he said. Peter's first case is in January, she said. Water rights dispute, ironically. He looked at her, almost smiled. Appropriate. She looked down at the blackberry stain on her palm. I remember standing in this creek thinking I had ruined everything, she said, that I'd trespassed and panicked a rancher, and I was going to be sent back to Bannock on foot with no berries, and considerably less dignity than I'd arrived with. He was quiet for a moment. You had plenty of dignity, he said. Even then. She looked at him. You were terrified, he said. And you still held your eyes steady, she considered this. Below the ridge, the school sat solid in its foundation, the stone walls warm from the day's sun. 34 students, 2 teachers, a library that was the best within 40 miles, children who could read, who understood fractions and land law and basic chemistry, who knew their rights, because someone had spent 10 years making sure they did. A wrong turn in the wrong canyon, a basket of blackberries, a soft apology in a creek bed. She smiled, looking at the canyon going to shadow. I didn't know, she said softly. He turned to look at her. That first day, she said, when I said I was sorry, I didn't know I meant about the trespass, about being on your land. She paused. But I didn't know any of it. I didn't know what was going to happen, any of it. He was quiet, looking at her profile against the last of the light. Neither did I, he said. She reached for his hand. He took it. His fingers were rough and certain, and he held her hand the way he had always held things that mattered, without loosening, without performance, just steadily. The canyon filled with shadow from the bottom up, and the peaks stayed light a little longer, and the creek ran on through the dark beneath them, clean and cold, and entirely their own. 34 children would come up the trail Monday morning, and the blackboard would be waiting, and there would be fractions and geography and words that opened the world wider than it had been the week before. This was the thing Sterling Vance had never understood. You could not damn a school. You could not file a challenge against an idea whose time had come. You could not arrest a mind that had already shown other minds what was possible. The mountain didn't need to be skinny to be great. The worth was always in the heart and the work. Mabel Westford stood on her ridge in the last light of an August evening, and she was exactly where she had always been going. And so ends the story of Jedediah Westford and Mabel Henderson, 2 people who found each other at the edge of a creek in the middle of a canyon at the exact moment when both of them had stopped expecting to be seen. But before we close the book on Westford Ridge, I want to talk to you for a moment. Not about the story. About what the story was actually saying underneath all the gunshots and blizzards and berry patches. Because this wasn't just a romance. It never was. Mabel Henderson came to Montana with nothing except her mind and her refusal to accept that the size of her body determined the size of her life. Boston had told her she was too broad, too full, too large for the delicate frame that high society had decided a proper woman should occupy. And she looked at that verdict, and she packed her bags, and she rode 11 miles through the wrong canyon, on bad directions. And she stood in a stranger's creek and whispered her apology. And then she got up the next morning and started building a school. That is not a small thing. That is one of the bravest things a human being can do. To take the place that told you that you didn't fit and leave it. To walk toward the unknown because the known had already shown you its ceiling. To arrive somewhere completely new, blistered and exhausted and uncertain, and still choose to be useful. Jed Westford taught us something different, but equally important. He taught us that real strength, the kind that actually matters, the kind that lasts, has nothing to do with dominance. It has to do with seeing. He looked at a woman the world had discarded, and he saw her worth before he knew her name. He handed her his mother's boots, not out of charity, but out of recognition. He sat beside her at the kitchen table, over land law and water rights, not because he needed her help, but because he understood that her mind was a resource as real and as valuable as any acre of Montana ranch land, and that wasting it would be its own kind of crime. The partnership between them is the heart of this whole story. They didn't divide the world into his problems and her problems. They took the problems as they came, and they worked them together legally, physically, intellectually. When Vance tried to take the water, Mabel found the loophole in the territorial statute. When Vance jailed her, Jed rode through a blizzard. When the guards chose the wrong side, Mabel talked to them about their children. Every time one of them hit a wall, the other found the door. That is what a real partnership looks like. Not one person carrying the other. Two people carrying the load, trading off, neither one pretending they can do it alone. And the children. Don't overlook the children in this story, because they are the whole point of it. Thomas Briggs, who sat in the front row and went on to become an engineer. Peter Hendricks, whose father's jacket pocket held the rock that cracked Vance's empire open, and who grew up to practice the law that once imprisoned his teacher. Lucy Driscoll, who erased her first sentence because she wasn't ready for anyone else to see it yet, and who eventually built a school of her own. These children didn't change because someone gave them charity. They changed because someone gave them knowledge, because someone looked at them and said clearly and without qualification that their futures were not already decided. That is what education does. That is its actual power. It doesn't just fill a child's head with facts. It shows a child that their mind is theirs, that it belongs to them and not to whoever has the most money or the most authority or the loudest voice in the room. Sterling Vance understood this, which is exactly why he tried to stop it. Men who build empires on other people's limitations are always afraid of schools. That is what this story is about, and that is why it's worth telling. This story is a work of historical fiction. All characters, events, and dialogue are fictional and created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only.